All right. So as I said in the previous session, what we did, we basically looked at the prerequisites. Now, prerequisites not for Sentinel, prerequisites for Sentinel, but based on the environment that we needed to build because we did not have an environment. So what we did, we looked at prerequisites. We set up the working environment. That's what we did. We provisioned, you know, we subscribed to so basically we built the environment from scratch. So we subscribed to an Azure subscription, then we configured Azure Active Directory, some services in Azure Active Directory. We provisioned a couple of users. We also, is the session getting recorded? I just want to make sure that it's recorded. Okay, great. So we provisioned a couple of users. We also created security groups. We added those users to the respective security groups. We also assign licenses to the users. That's what we did in Azure AD. Uh, to begin with, I'm saying at a bare minimum, this is what we did in Azure AD. So we basically built our landing zone or minimum viable cloud. The minimum viable cloud that we actually need to understand and explore the Sentinel capabilities. We also built a couple of virtual machines. We built network security groups. We built virtual network. We built storage accounts. So that's what we built and provisioned, all of those services. And after that part was done, after the working environment was built, we enabled monitoring. Now, when I say monitoring, we enable the monitoring not from performance perspective, because performance monitoring is not our objective. Performance monitoring is also done by using the same tool. However, we are more focused on security monitoring. So what we did, we basically enabled event logs, sys logs, and we also did, performance insights. Some of you also enabled performance monitoring for the virtual machines. We also enabled diagnostic logs from services. So what services did we enable diagnostic logs from? We enabled it from storage account, virtual network. We enabled it from activity logs, the Azure activity logs. That's what we enable diagnostic logs from. Now, diagnostic logs capability is available in all the services. So most of the services, 99% of the services that you deploy in Microsoft Azure Cloud under monitoring, they have an option to enable diagnostic logs and stream those logs to a storage account, to a log analytics workspace, to an event hub, or to a partner solution. So we primarily followed log analytics workspace. We basically enabled diagnostic logs for services to log analytics workspace, the log analytics workspace, which is connected or which is integrated with Microsoft Sentinel Service. So that's what we did. We enabled diagnostic logs. Then we verified whether logs are being received in LA workspace. The log analytics workspace that we created, whether logs are being received in that workspace or not, we verified by writing some KQL queries, and we verified. I'm saying for virtual machines, we looked at heartbeat. So we basically verified whether the logs are coming. For activity logs, we typed activity logs and various parameters. So that's what we looked at. Then we looked at Sentinel. Sorry, we basically looked at KQL, Custo query language. And in the Custo query language, I basically talked about some common KQLs. I'm saying, first of all, I talked about building blocks of it, various switches that you can use in KQL. switches and common KQL. That's what we did. And that's where we spend some time in understanding how do we write KQL queries, how do we save KQL queries, how do we make use of pre-configured queries. That is what we looked at. So that's exactly what we did. And then the last session that we had in July 21st, we basically enabled all of these connectors, Active Directory. So KQL we looked at, and then we also enabled, then we looked at Content Hub, that what is my Content Hub, which is the repository of various solutions available for Sentinel. That's what we looked at. And Content Hub now, so Microsoft has done a lot of changes in the past, and they keep on doing those changes. They will continue to change it, but they change to improvise, to enhance the end user experience, to make it simple. That's why they change the technology, they change the options within a specific service or technology. So that's what Microsoft does. So earlier you would have analytics rule, you would have workbook, you would have playbooks, you would have connectors, all separate. But now what Microsoft has done, they have put together everything into the Content Hub in the form of a solution, and they put them together and formed a solution. So there's a solution with the name Azure Active Directory. Let's say, let me also log into the portal. Sign up with this thing. So I'm logging into Sentinel dashboard. And inside Sentinel dashboard, under content management, you see Content Hub or Content Hub, whatever you want to pronounce it as. And here you will see all the solutions. So let's say Azure Active Directory is one of the solution. So what they have done, they have consolidated everything related to Azure Active Directory, which includes a data connector, 11 playbooks, 2 workbook, 59 analytics rules. That's what they have done. And they have also given you the pricing, which is free. So majority of the solutions that you see here, they are available free of cost. Microsoft is not charging anything for these solutions because it typically charges for the service. So it cannot charge you for the individual component inside the service. So it basically gives you solutions in the Content Hub, which summarizes, which consolidates all the capabilities around that solution. That's what Microsoft has done. So what we did, we basically installed a couple of solutions, and then we configured data connector from the solutions itself. That's what we also did. And after we configured data connector, we also verified whether appropriate log data is being received in a workspace related to that data connector. So that's what we typically did in the last week at a very high level. I'm trying to summarize. Uh, Let me know if you have any question from all of these topics that I just summarized before we move on to the design discussions, design and architecture discussions, which is more of a theoretical session. And then we'll move on to the configuration of Sentinel once again, the way we were doing it last week. But today we want to focus on the design discussions, the architectural best practices, the workplace best practices. I would say all that happens in the initial phase when, so consider yourself as part of a project team and you've just received a requirement from the customer. Customer is either new to SIEM and SOAR solution. They want to enable security monitoring using Azure Cloud Native SIEM and SOAR solution, which is Microsoft Sentinel, or they have an existing SIEM solution, let's say ArcSight, Alert Logic, Securonix, IBM, QRadar, Splunk, and they want to migrate from this existing SIEM to a cloud native SIEM, and they have chosen Microsoft Sentinel or Azure Sentinel. Now you form a project team, and your job is to initiate the dialogue with the customer and implement the solution. So you cannot directly implement the solution. You will need to uh, take a lot of information. You will need certain inputs coming from the customer, from the SMEs at the customer side, and those inputs would vary depending on what the use case is, whether they want to start afresh, whether they have an existing SIEM solution. So what will be my design considerations? How do I put together a design for Sentinel, considering size, scale, and complexity of the customer? So when I say size, scale, and complexity, how big that customer is, what is the business that they are in, how many offices or how many locations they are present at, the geographical presence, whether they have centralized IT or decentralized IT, what kind of security policies they have in place, what are the regulatory standards and compliances that they need to adhere to. All of that goes into the planning part, into the initial discussion part, because based on the outcome of all of these questions, you will be putting together a design. You will, you will create an HLD and LLD, high level design document and low level design document, and you will submit it to the customer for the review and approval. Once it is reviewed and approved, then only you will get into the implementation. So what happens before we actually get into the implementation is what we are going to focus today. So before we get started, I would like to take a pause here and see if I have any participant who has any question from the topics that we covered last week. All right. I had some action items on me. The first one was for Yogesh, wherein Yogesh needed the KQL script to query the amount of log ingested into log analytics workspace according to a time frame. So Yogesh, if you're there in the session, I've just typed the KQL query into the chat box. Using this query, you can manipulate the time. I say you can change the time in 24 hours, 1 day, 2 day, 5 day, and this query will basically return the amount of logs in GB that has been inserted into the log analytics workspace. So you can always verify this information. However, with the, as I said, after Microsoft released the log analytics workspace insights, which is powered by my Azure Monitor, you hardly need to run any query with respect to getting any information for the workspace, because it gives you all the information related to the workspace configuration in the form of UI itself. So here's the insight that you see, which gives you all the ingested volume, which gives you information about the agents which are sending the heartbeats, inactive agents, retention period for the workspace, daily usage cap, if there is any that has been put here, and then it gives you total volume in terms of the events which are coming or the logs which are coming from various log sources. For example, you can see majority of the logs are coming from performance data, which is CPU, memory, disk, and network utilization. Then you also are getting insight logs. You're getting events, which is Windows events, access log. You're getting events from connectors also, which is AWS connector, and you're also getting logs or events from Azure activity. Here's the bifurcation of the total volume, total amount of logs which are getting ingested. You can see the bifurcation over time also, that at which time the logs are getting ingested, and all of this information is available. It also shows you ingestion anomalies, that what was my maximum, what is my minimum, all of that it basically shows you. So it shows you usage, it shows you health data also. You can see all the tables. These are the tables in the workspace, and here's the usage across the tables. It shows you health, the health of the service itself, which is the health of the log analytics service. It also shows you the health information of the service, that the service has been working properly. It shows you agent specific information. It shows you any audit that you want to and any log to the service configuration changes. So that's what it basically shows you. I would say this gives you a lot of information which we would depend on running KQL queries in the past to get. So I still remember using KQL or sharing KQL with the operations team to fetch this information in terms of how many agents are there, if there is any agent that has not been sending heartbeats, unhealthy agent, service related information. All of that is now possible through this, uh, through this insight itself, which is nothing but a workbook, which is nothing but a dashboard. So this information is now very much available, and you can also select the time frame here, and accordingly you can get the information. But the best practice is to always keep it at last 24 hours, so you will always know that what has been how this service has been working in the last 24 hours. So that was for Yogesh. This was one of the action item on me that I remember. If there was any other action item on me from the last week, just let me know, and I'll see if I have already worked on it, because this all of a sudden came to my mind and I shared the script. All right. If there is no other question from the participants, let's get started for today. Okay. So let's start with the now consider yourself. I'm saying you will understand it well when you put yourself into the shoes of an architect or the shoes of a consultant or somebody who is initiating the dialogue with the customer to understand the current environment as well as the current landscape of the customer as well as the objective of the customer. So you need to understand all the three items. You need to understand the current environment. When I say current environment, you basically need to understand whether the customer has an existing SIEM. Yes, no. That's what you need to understand. The current environment of the customer, then current landscape. That what is the landscape of my customer? So when I say current landscape, you basically need to identify the workloads that the customer has, applications, various devices, locations, employee types. When I say employee types, you basically, so workloads, basically all the servers, uh, and workloads would also include whether they are physical, whether they are virtual. If they are virtual, then are they using Hyper-V or VMware or Citrix? Which type of virtualization? Workloads also includes data centers. How many data centers do they have? Applications, different types of applications that the customer is using. Now this would include any, the application would include both in-house developed as well as third-party application. It would, and then you will need to understand the devices, that what devices they have, devices in the sense endpoints, that whether customer is using laptops, whether employees are using desktops only or some employees have got laptops. If yes, then what is the brand, what operating system, all of that information you need. You may feel that why so much of information I'm collating, this is needed because when you put together the Sentinel implementation, this information will be needed to ensure that you have taken into consideration all aspects of it. So you need devices information. Then you need locations information, whether customer has its own data centers, whether customer is using a co-location facility. If customer has presence in one geography or customer has multiple geographies. I'm saying if it's a, if it's a small company if it's a medium enterprise, if it's a large enterprise, if it's, if it has operations in multiple countries, all of that you need to understand. Employee types, whether customer only has full-time employees or contractual employees also. If there are third-party vendors who are also working for the customer, who are also supporting your customer for various aspects. I mean, say they are supporting your customer from infrastructure perspective, they're supporting your customer for application development and support perspective, they're supporting your customer for any audit perspective. So you need all of that information. And the most important information that you need is security standards and compliances. So you basically need to know what all security standards has the customer enabled in its current environment, current landscape, and what all compliances, law of the land, the customer needs to adhere to based on the business, based on the industry vertical that the customer is coming from, whether customer is into aerospace, aviation, oil and gas, manufacturing, FMCG, BFSI, hospitality. You will need to have that visibility, because based on that industry vertical, there will be certain compliances which apply to that industry vertical. And you also need to understand the location part here, because this location will also define the compliances. You will also need to understand whether customer is a public entity, because if the customer is a public entity and if there are stakeholders, if there are interests of people into this business, when there are stakeholders, then will be compliances like SOC. So you will need to understand all of this information, and all of this information will not be available on day one. There will be multiple rounds of meeting that you will start with, that you will need to basically schedule with your customer. You will, so it all starts with a mobilization phase. I would say, if you want to understand in a linear and logical terminology, we call it mobilization phase, wherein there will be a project manager at both sides, an engagement manager, project manager, program manager, whatever terminology you may want to use. So there will be stakeholders at both sides whose job is to identify the team, nominate the team members, ensure that the initial kickoff meeting happens across the sites, and then a project plan is shared, is reviewed and approved by both sides. And then as per the project plan, the milestones are identified, schedules is identified, dates are identified. I would say some milestones along with the schedule will be identified, and then it all starts. So when it all starts, it will be known as mobilization phase, because that's where you're putting together the team member. And before you start your first meeting, you will have identified the level of access that you would require at the customer side on the workloads and applications, so that you can quickly do an assessment. So all of that goes into the mobilization phase. So this will be part of the mobilization phase itself. And then you start the meeting and you start to collate all of this information, because sometimes you will not get all of this information through documentation, or uh, through Microsoft Teams, or through phone calls, or let's say online meetings. There are times when customers share certain information through documentation, through various documentation or Confluence knowledge base that they are maintaining. So they'll give you access to the Confluence, through which you can gain some visibility into the customer's environment. Or they would rather share most of the information in the meeting itself, in the brainstorming session. Sometimes that session can happen in person, wherein you will travel to customer's premise along with your team members in person and have a discussion, or you will have an online discussion with the customer and gather all of this information. So this is all is very important. I'm saying you just need to gather all of this information, which is very important, whether you gather it through documentation, through online discussion, through in-person meeting. But this information is very important. This information is important for this, to the next steps. So once you have collated this information, the current environment information, current landscape information, and this landscape information also includes the objectives, that what are the objectives of your customer, objectives and expectations with new technology. And this new technology here is Sentinel. In this case, that what are my customers' objectives and expectations with this new technology? You also need to get into the history to understand why why they are considering Sentinel, what went wrong, what happened in the past, was there any security incident? If yes, then what that incident was, what was the impact of it, what did they lose? Did they lose money? Did they lose revenue? Did they lose end user experience? Did they lose, uh, you know, I'm saying you just need to understand the impact of it. Was there any sanction that was put on the customer by the government because of that security incident? You need to understand all of it. See why we are spending last 5-10 minutes on discussing all of this, because unless and until you understand what my customer needs, who my customer is, you will not be able to put together, or you will not be able to suggest or provide them a solution which makes sense to them, which makes sense to them in the near term as well as in the long term. So that is where you need to understand their near term and long term objectives. You need to understand their expectations. If you go by the process, I would say if it is all about being technical and implementing a solution, it hardly takes a couple of hours to a day, or let's say 2-3 days. But it is not about it. Even when you are working as a technology person, you cannot leave this flavor of being, a human at the end of the day, and you're interacting with human. So if you really want to be a good consultant or a good architect, I'm just sharing from my experience, because i already I always have received appreciation from my customer on that part, that he's not a technology person, he's somebody who understands, who understands us, he understands our requirement. He just don't focus on technology all the time. He don't focus on timelines and milestones. He focuses on our requirements, our objectives, and he always provides us the right solution. He always thinks from near-term and long-term perspective. He don't. I'm saying there had been incidents in the past when my management was not happy with me. Why? Because I was thinking from the customer side. I was, though I was representing an implementation team or heading the implementation team, but I was more focused about my customer. So my objective was to save money. My objective, when I was saving money for my customer, my company was losing money also at the same time. Because when you suggest the customer that a specific solution is not needed, and in your project plan that solution is there, and you have identified some dollar value against that solution for the implementation, you're losing that money. So you need to strike a balance. That is what I have learned over the last couple of years, working in these project implementation or heading the project implementation or heading the customer, that you need to learn to strike the balance. You should not, you must not offend your employer by suggesting something which will reduce their overall revenue of that project, or which will create a conflict of interest with your customer or trust factor. But at the same time, you should not forget at the end of the day that you are a technical person. Your job is to provide the right information. You're not a sales and marketing or pre-sales person who will do everything to sell that solution to the customer, because it is their job. They have targets. They need to meet deadlines. They need to meet those dollar value targets, which is part of their KPIs and KPAs. So you're a technical person, focus on technology. And while you focus on technology, don't lose your human side. Because I've seen that. I I had been into multiple projects implementation across multiple geographies, and I've seen from my own eyes that how it happens. So at the end of the day, you will need to make sure that you leave smile at your customer's face. And that is only possible when you do it honestly. So always suggest if something has changed, if something has come new, suggest it to the customer that there has been an update in the service. The what we proposed in the project plan is something which is not applicable. For example, Azure monitor logs. If I wanted, I could have delivered this training with log analytics agent, but I did propose it and I said that a year later, this will not be applicable. This will get deprecated. So let's learn it in the manner that will continue to be good to go in the next couple of years. So this is how I used to work. That I would make sure to talk about everything which makes sense, which will be relevant, which is relevant today, which will remain relevant tomorrow. And if something is changing, I would like to implement it today so that my customer is not running another project 6 months down the line and unnecessarily going through a lot of downtime, going through a lot of disruption in the business, and also end up paying more money to the same company who did the implementation or to another company that they chose. So just look at the situation, understand the situation, and then accordingly take a decision what is right for your customer and what is right for you at the same time also, because I don't want you to lose your credibility into the system. I don't want you to lose your job also at the end of the day. So so this is what you need to understand as a current landscape. Now when you have understood the current landscape, then you will need to take the decisions. So design decisions will be based on the design considerations, and it all starts with data residency. That's the very first thing, because you need to understand that Sentinel is a security monitoring solution. So Sentinel is my security monitoring solution. It is going to monitor for security incidents. And when it monitors, it would need some data. It would need inputs. And those inputs to Sentinel comes in the form of log. So it needs logs. It is nothing but a service that analyzes logs and provides intelligence. That's what Sentinel does. So it needs logs. Now the question is, when it starts with it needs log, the question is that what type of logs Sentinel needs. So the question is, what does a log constitute? So what does it constitute? I'm saying what is the specific information which is available in the log? That is what you need to understand. So the that what is there in the log, the data or information which is available in the log, and why we are doing at this level, why are we trying to understand this log or break this log into segments, because it's a security solution, and and various geographies have local compliances. So we have local and global compliances. And these local and global compliances, they all deal with information. I'm saying data and information. Compliance is all about data and information security. That how do you process, how do you create, how do you store, how do you retain, how do you discard? It's all about data and information security. So you will need all of this information, that what are my inputs? I'm saying what are the type of logs that I am collecting, where exactly I'm collecting those logs. So that also means log repository, that what is my log repository, what service, and the same question, what service and what location. You need to get this answer, that where exactly your log repositories are, what service that log repository is, and what kind of logs it is collating, and what location the logs are coming from, and then what information is there in the log. So there are times when the logs may contain PII. Now, what is PII? PII is personal identifiable information. So if logs are containing PII, then you will need to think of compliances, because there are compliances which regulates, which enforces, or which provides guidance in terms of how you need to deal with PII information. Now, what is PII information? Personal identifiable information. It's like email ID of a person. It's like name of a person. It's like name, age, sex, location, email address, home address, contact address, mobile phone number. That's all personal identifiable information, because from this information you can identify a person. Now PII has multiple, categories. I am just trying to explain it at a high level, because we are not doing certifications on CISSP or CCSP wherein you need to get into detail of it. But what you need to understand is your logs, because your logs will contain the information. So you need to understand what kind of information my logs contain. And if your logs are containing PII information, then you will need to think of compliances that your customer needs to adhere. And then you will need to ask more questions to your customer. If the customer says that yes, and there is a probability that log contains PII information, there are some logs, logs from Azure Active Directory will contain PII information. Logs from various logs from Azure AD Identity Protection will contain the PII. Logs from Azure Purview or any Azure Information Protection will contain the PII. So logs will contain the PII. Logs will contain the confidential data or the reference of confidential data. Then you also need to protect that reference, because that reference can disclose some properties of that data. So this is very important, and that is where this concept comes into the picture, which is data residency. That what is my data residency? So you need to understand the data residency and localization requirements. Two things here you need to understand is data residency and localization. For your customer as well as Sentinel service. So what is my data residency and localization requirements? So you need to ask this customer that what are your data residency and localization requirements. If they know, well, if they don't know, then you need to identify based on these parameters that you are collecting here, based on these decisions that you are making, that what are their data residency and localization requirements. For example, if the customer is in India, what is the data residency and localization requirement? Do we have a law? No. There is a law which is getting prepared, Data Protection Act. It is getting tabled in the parliament in every session, but it is not getting approved by majority of the house so that it becomes a law. So when it comes to India, it is very flexible. Things are very dooming. It is not clear. However, there are expectations from the government that any data related to the citizens of India, similar to GDPR, any data related to the business which operate in India should remain within the geographical boundaries of India. But that's the expectation, not a law. So as far as it is India, you can decide. As far as the law is not enforced, it is not in place, you can take your decision. But you need to understand the data residency and localization law. In US, you have data residency and localization law as per the federal government, as well as the state government. So in US, states have their own laws, and then there's a federal law which covers the entire United States of America. Now, when you are doing business in US, or when you are deploying this solution for a customer in US, you will need to understand that where is the majority of employees located, where is the majority of offices located, where does the majority of customers comes from. You need to understand all of it, because that's what the designing or architecture is all about. And it doesn't happen. I'm saying implementation is very easy. Once you have identified all of it, implementation will not take much time, because implementation is about enabling the solution for which you will get a lot of references. But these are the discussions for which there is no reference available. You only have best practices, you only have some guidances available. So we have this information. Now, I still remember working with this customer. I would say, I worked with Blue Voyant for some time, and I worked with their team to put together this documentation, Azure Sentinel deployment best practices. I'll be sharing this documentation with you, and you will see a summary of what I'm covering here in that documentation also. But since the documentation is 70 plus pages long, and I don't want you to spend 5, 6 hours, 10 hours going through the documentation, I'm trying to summarize what is there in the documentation. So this is very important, data residency and localization. And as I said, you will also need to, and since data residency and localization is very important, and it basically involves that where exactly are you going to store your data, what does that data and information include? So the question comes that where does Sentinel service is configured? So what is my data residency for Sentinel service? So when I say Sentinel service, the question is, if you remember from last week, what did you do? You added a workspace to Sentinel service. That's what you did. The question is, did you choose location for Sentinel service? And so when you provision virtual machine, storage account, or network, you remember choosing a location: East US, West US, Australia, India, Central India, while provisioning the service. But did you choose a location while you enable Sentinel? Yes, no, maybe.
No.
Prashant, Yogesh, Triveni, did you remember choosing a location when you enabled Sentinel?
No, no, Raghu.
No, I
No.
think when we create a workspace, we choose the location.
What do we create?
Log
Come again?
analytic workspace.
Okay, but Log Analytics Workspace is a different service. I mean, say, even if you don't use Sentinel in your company, you can still use Log Analytics Workspace. It's a log repository. I'm talking about Sentinel. Did we choose a location for Sentinel service when we enabled it in our subscription? So the answer is no. Okay, so we did not choose a location. Next question. Quentin is typing something. Okay, so we did not choose a location. Now let's understand what is food for thought for Sentinel. I'm saying food for thought. So what is the service that is enabling Sentinel, that is giving food to Sentinel, that is giving the input to Sentinel so that Sentinel can provide the information? What is that service?
It's log
Just
analytic workspace.
it's Log Analytics Workspace. That's my food for thought for Sentinel. I'm saying that's the input. Sentinel is connected to a Log Analytics Workspace, or Sentinel is reading logs from a Log Analytics Workspace, and then it is creating incidents. Is everyone with me on this? Yes, no, maybe? Okay. So now the question is, did we choose a location when we created Log Analytics Workspace? Yes,
Yes.
no. Great. So we did choose a location when we created Log Analytics Workspace, and that location, whatever that location is, So let's say the location is East US, which is North Virginia. Just imagine the data center is in North Virginia, which is in the United States of America, and that is where my logs are getting ingested. So my logs are getting ingested into East US, and Sentinel is basically reading logs from this location, from East US. Okay. So that's what Sentinel is doing. So which means Sentinel doesn't need a location. Sentinel is a service which needs inputs, logs, and that logs are stored into the log analytics workspace for which we are choosing the location. Now the question is that if Sentinel does not have, Sentinel is not a regional service, then what it is? So the answer is Sentinel is a PaaS service. You can also call it a SaaS service up to certain extents. It's a PaaS or SaaS service, or to avoid the confusion, I can say it's a fully managed service. It's a fully managed service by Microsoft. And why it is fully managed? Because the underlying infrastructure for Sentinel is managed by Microsoft. What you see is nothing but a dashboard of Sentinel service in the Azure portal. But what enables this dashboard? Are the how many servers, what is the level of configuration that is done in the backend is not visible to you. You don't even know what that configuration is. For you, it's just an analysis service. It's just a security monitoring service. So it's a fully managed service from Microsoft, and it's a global service. So Sentinel is a global service. Log Analytics Workspace is a regional service because when you create a Log Analytics Workspace, you choose a region. So it's a regional service. But Sentinel is a global service. When I say Sentinel is a global service, it also means that it is not available in all the regions of Microsoft. So this service is not available in all the regions. Now, if this service is not available in all the regions, there is a high probability that, let's say, you have your LA workspace, your log analytics workspace in India. And in India, your workspace is in Central India, or you can say South India, wheresoever. This is your log analytics workspace location, Central and South India. And then you enable Sentinel. So what you do, you have log analytics workspace in India, which is Central or South India, and then you onboard workspace into Sentinel. Now you onboard this workspace into Sentinel. Sentinel starts reading or analyzing the logs from this workspace. Sentinel starts doing its job. Now the question is, which is very important for you need to understand, that is Sentinel storing some logs, or is Sentinel storing its analysis data? So is Sentinel storing some logs or Sentinel storing some analysis data? We can call it metadata also. So the question is Sentinel storing something? See, Sentinel is reading logs from Log Analytics Workspace, doing the analysis, presenting you the results on the dashboard based on the solutions and connectors and analytics rule that you configured, and you will see the incidents. So Sentinel is doing all of it. But the question is Sentinel storing some log analysis data, which is metadata? And if yes, then where exactly Sentinel is storing? So the answer, if this answer of this question is yes, then where exactly Sentinel is storing metadata? because this metadata may also contain PII. This is the big question that you need to answer. And this question will come into the picture when your probable customer is coming from NBFC, BFSI, health, insurance, aviation, hospitality. If this happens, you will need to know the answer of this customer. And also, if your customer is a government. So if your customer is one of these industries, you will need answer of this question. Because without this answer, you will put yourself in trouble in the long run. So this is very important. You need to understand that where is Sentinel, what Sentinel is, how does it work, what information does it store and process, where exactly does it store, whether this service is available in all the region. So for that, we have a documentation from Azure, which they keep updating all the time as and when they make this service available to all the region. Right now, if you want to see whether, let me take you to that documentation. The reason I also have a presentation on the same, but I will not go with the presentation reason because that presentation can be outdated, but this document will always remain up to date. The last time this document was updated on July 7th. And if you are reading, if you are referencing to this document, or if you are making decision based on this document, while you have a discussion with your customer, and even if your decision or even if your information is not up to date, customer will not blame you for it, because you can always say at the end of the day, sir, this is not my in-house product. It's a third-party service from Microsoft. We are a consultant. We rely heavily on Microsoft for the accurate information. And source of information is always the documentation, OEM. And as per the documentation, here's the information. So always refer to the OEM documentation for the information. This will keep you out from conflict. Now, this is where you need to understand. So it says, after your data is collected, stored and processed, compliance can become an important design requirement with a significant impact on your Microsoft Sentinel architecture. Having the ability to validate and prove who has access to what data under all conditions is critical. For data sovereignty requirement in many countries and regions. For example, Europe, GDPR is very important there. And so GDPR is there, and GDPR deals with PII. So if you are deploying Sentinel in Europe, or if you are deploying Sentinel for a customer who also have operations in Europe and US and India, then where exactly your Sentinel will be is the big question that you need to be asking, and you need answer of this question. So data sovereignty in many countries and regions, and assessing risk and getting insights in Microsoft Sentinel workflows is a priority for many customers. So the question is, where exactly Sentinel is storing the data? Because Sentinel is also storing some metadata. It is not Log Analytics Workspace which is storing the data. It is Sentinel Service which is also storing some fraction, some portion of analyzed data, which is known as metadata. And that metadata also has a lot of visibility. So where exactly Microsoft Sentinel data is stored? Microsoft Sentinel is a non-regional service. So it is not restricted to a region. However, Microsoft Sentinel is built on the top of Azure Monitor Logs, which is a regional service. So Microsoft Sentinel is built on the Azure Monitor Logs, which is a regional service. Now, Microsoft Sentinel can run on workspaces in these supported regions. These are the regions. Regions where log analytics is newly available may take time to onboard Microsoft Sentinel service. Microsoft Sentinel stores customers' data in the same geography as the log analytics workspace associated with Microsoft Sentinel. Now, this is where the crux is. However, there's a catch here. So if you go by the statement, it says Microsoft Sentinel stores customers' data in the same geography as the log analytics workspace associated with the Microsoft Sentinel. So if my log analytics workspace is associated in East US, then Microsoft Sentinel will store the data in East US. And then I don't have to bother about compliance. However, Microsoft Sentinel is not available in all the regions. So Microsoft Sentinel processes customers' data in one or two locations. If the log analytics workspace is located in Europe, customers' data is processed in Europe. For all other locations, customer data is processed in the US. Now, this is where the crux is. So, since Europe has GDPR and they are very stringent on GDPR, they have put sanctions and penalized a lot of businesses in the past. Microsoft is also cognizant of the fact. So, if the log analytics workspace is in Europe, the data will be stored and processed in Europe itself by the Sentinel. So the metadata is in Europe. But for all other locations, customers' data is processed in the US, which means that even if you have your workspace in India, central India, the data will be processed in the US. And these are the supported regions. Microsoft Sentinel can run on workspaces in the following region. So these are the regions. If you see specifically for India, let's say, which is Asia, in Asia, it is East Asia, Southeast Asia, Qatar Central. Do you see India? Okay, over here. Central India, South India, West India, Geo India West, Geo India Central. Now, what is this Geo? So Reliance Geo also has a cloud, and they have integrated with Microsoft because they cannot build all these services by themselves and they didn't want to invest. So they built some native services and then they integrated with Microsoft. And now they are offering Microsoft cloud services from Geo Cloud also. So that is why Microsoft is providing its services to Geo. So we have some Geo also. So forget about Geo for a moment. You can see here. So in India, there are three regions. This West India does not exist anymore because this West India used to be Mumbai and Microsoft has closed its Mumbai data center for new customers. And Microsoft is moving all the customers from West India to South Central India, which is Hyderabad. So these are the three locations where Sentinels, where log analytics service is available. But what you need to understand is that even if your log analytics service is configured here, your logs are stored in this location, but never ever forget that your logs are getting read or analyzed by a service which is in US and the metadata will be stored in US. If you agree to this arrangement, then only go with Sentinel. Otherwise, go for a third-party solution. This is what you need to tell your customer on day one. And to who at your customer side? The security and compliance team stakeholder. So you will have an SME joining from security and compliance team also. I'm saying when you are doing the brainstorming discussions, when it is both parties who are discussing, it is not one person. It is the experts, SMEs from various domains. So you need to have, when you are taking the design, when you are doing the design discussions on Sentinel, you need to make sure that you have a security and compliance team representative from your customer side who will be given this information. And when they agree to this, then only you need to proceed further. And this is where I had majority of the challenges. Because the moment I'll tell my customer that your data is going to be processed from US, the customer may have 10 different questions coming on the table. Okay. What data are they processing? Are they storing that data in US? If yes, then for how long? How are they going to discard the data? What will be their retention? What is that data? What information does it contain? Those are the subsequent questions that you will hear from your customer. And for that, you will need to take Microsoft in the call because Microsoft can only answer this question. I'm saying you can answer this question, but they may not trust you. They will need a written confirmation from Microsoft so that tomorrow they will not be in trouble because of any compliance. So at this stage, most of the time, you will have a Microsoft representative who will then join the call and who will then give the confidence to the customer, who will then show the metadata to the customer that this is the metadata that we collect. And this is how we discard the metadata. This is our retention. And they will also send a written communication to the customer so that customer will keep that communication on record to show it to any agency or compliance if the customer comes, if that comes into the picture in future. Is that understood, everyone? Because this is the most important thing that you need to understand as an architectural, I'm saying, if you have interest into the design and architecture for Sentinel. I'll take a pause and I'm open for any questions that you may have.
Raghu, which particular location will it take in the case of US? Will it automatically assign, or is there a particular region in US like East US, West US?
That information is unknown to us. That is with Microsoft. Microsoft never reveals that information on the documentation, or in fact, Microsoft has never ever revealed that information. But I can tell you, I'm say offline, that this is North Virginia, East US.
Okay, thank you.
But never ever tell it to your customer. I'm saying if your customer says that give it written, never ever do that. Ask Microsoft to do it. I have multiple project plans for Sentinel deployment, multiple documentation, and I also have those emails from Microsoft as an evidence. So Microsoft will not also tell which region is this because it's a security solution. See, when it comes to security, few things cannot be spoken. Few things cannot be shared in writing. It is about trust. So customer has to trust. And that is where if you see this geography, nobody uses Sentinel from here. And you know the reason why. Because these two countries don't see them eye to eye. There are challenges. And that is why the natives of this country or businesses operating in this country, they don't want to take risk. They never know when their country's government change the policies, when they come into scrutiny. So nobody uses Sentinel from here. Microsoft also had to struggle a lot to enter this geography. They are not operating in this geography independently. There is this company which is managing Microsoft cloud businesses in that geography. So this geography is critical. Europe, which is another critical geography, but for Europe, they have an arrangement. They have it in North Europe. North Europe is the location where Sentinel is configured. So Sentinel is configured in two places in the world, US and Europe. That's it. Rest of the geographies, these Sentinel deployments will take care of it. Make sense? So this was very important point that you need to understand, that you need to be aware, because this may cause a trouble in future. And I'll give you an example. Back in 2019, when this first line was not there, it did not exist. Only this exists. There was a case, I'm saying, I still remember, and the customer had to pay the penalty. So what happened? This customer basically started using Sentinel. This customer is from India. This customer had operations in US. This customer is a Microsoft shop. So this customer uses Microsoft services as and when they are introduced. So Microsoft Sentinel service was introduced 2019. It got the popularity that it needed, and customer decided to use it. So what customer did? Customer actually started using Microsoft Sentinel service, and since the data was getting processed in US, and customer did not inform Microsoft that they had application which has references to GDPR, I'm saying which needs to adhere to GDPR because it processes information of some of the European customers also. So they were using a centralized SAP solution. SAP has HR module, and their HR module was not bifurcated into geography. I mean, so the issue was with the customer itself, that their configuration was not adhering to the geographical compliances and standard. But when they enabled Sentinel, the Sentinel started doing its job. So Sentinel started collating the metadata and analysis data into the US. Now, when the audit happened for the customer, the auditor, they got it. I'm saying they could identify this, and they and since it was an external auditor, it was an independent auditor, and this audit was happening for their Europe business, the auditor reported it to the government that some of the data which may or may not contain PII, which may or may not violate GDPR, is being transmitted to US. And that's where the the enforcement agency in Europe, I'm saying whatever that enforcement agency is, they got into the contact and they started auditing the customer. And in the end, customer ended up paying huge penalty. And they also had to discontinue using Sentinel service. Both penalty and service discontinuation, both happened for the customer. And that was an alarming factor for Microsoft also to expedite. I'm saying Microsoft was already working on that strategy, but they knew that GDPR is there. They knew that compliances are there. They knew that issues will come in future. But that was an alarming factor for Microsoft, and Microsoft came up with this. So now Europe is Europe. Workspace is in Europe. So Sentinel is in Europe. All the data which Workspace is collecting, processing, Workspace is collecting, and Sentinel is processing is in Europe. But for rest of the locations, it is US. I would highly recommend you to inform your customer on day one so that they are well aware of this. And if possible, have it in record, have it in writing on an email so that you can always produce that email as a documentary evidence if something untoward happens. If your customer comes back you yelling, not happy with the fact that you never shared this information. Because if you don't share, customer will come to know, and one day. So this is the very important thing, that data residency you need to understand for Sentinel. So Microsoft Sentinel is available in two regions, Europe and US. For Europe, it is the entire Europe, and for US, it is the entire rest of the world. Okay, so that was the very first thing that you needed to understand on the data residency for Sentinel. Okay, so we are good with this data residency part. Okay, now that you have understood the data residency part for Sentinel, and you know that Europe is Europe and rest of the world is US, then what is my workspace design best practice? How will I design my workspace? Because I have log sources, I have services configured in multiple places. So what is my workspace design best practice? Should I be designing my workspace based on location where I operate as a business? Should I be designing my workspace based on environment? Let's say application environment, which is production, non-production. Should I design my workspace based on business units? I'm saying various business units within the company, because depending on what that company is, you can have centralized P&L, decentralized also. In some companies, you have multiple smaller companies functioning. In some companies, you have a centralized P&L, which means all the expenses of the company across various geographies are paid by the central agency. It is all central. There is no chargeback. In some companies, you have decentralization, which means you can have a common service being consumed by all the business units and departments, but at the end of the month, there's a team who will charge back for the specific consumption from all business units and department. So depending on business units and functions, should I be deploying Sentinel depending on business unit and functions? Or should I be deploying my workspace or designing my workspace based on regulatory standards and compliance, keeping regulatory standards and compliance in picture? So what should be my design strategy? I'm saying, what is my key decision vector. This is what you need to ask. Okay, so let's try and find answers to these questions. So let's start with the regulatory standards because we have already answered this question. So if there are regulatory standards and compliances that you need to adhere to, you already have the answer. That Sentinel is only available in India, in US and Europe. So if there are data sources in Europe, you will design a workspace in Europe also. So you will have a workspace in Europe, and then you will have a workspace for other geographies. So you will at least have two workspaces, which is one in Europe and one is outside of Europe. So that's the answer to this question. Then comes so this is for the regulatory requirements. Then comes the application environment, and application environment is also related to data sources. So my data sources or application environment. Now, the question is, do I want to log? Do I want to analyze the log? What my data source and what type of applications I have? So that's the another requirement that you want to understand that. And based on this, for example, I have majority of my data sources in cloud. I have majority of my data sources in on-premises. I have a combination of it. Then accordingly, you will have your workspace. You will identify that how do you want to design your workspace. And then comes the application environment. So in any environment, in any company, you will have at least two environments, production and non-production. You don't directly put anything into production. It goes through the staging, testing, uh, pre-prod, and then to prod. And see, most of the companies use DevOps pipeline, so they have environments. So production and non-production. So this is the another design consideration that you need to take, that if you want to design your workspace or if you want to design your Sentinel service, based on this, do you want to create workspaces to bifurcate production logs and non-production logs, or you want to create a common workspace which will contain both production and non-production logs? This is another design consideration. So regulatory standards, we have got the answer that we will have two workspaces, one in Europe and the other workspaces for the rest of the data sources. For application environment, it is your discretion whether you want to ingest non-production logs, but production, any which ways you will be ingesting. So that's the another consideration. Then comes the another consideration, which is on the admin and operations, and which is related to IAM, identity and access management, which is the access and permissions, that who will have what level of access and permission on the service. Because this is a security service. It contains security data. It contains crucial data. So not everyone can have access to it. You will need to identify the RBACs. You will need to use the least privilege principle. And you see, whatever are the best practices of identity and access management domain, you need to take them into consideration. So admin operations, that who will be my Sentinel admins, who will be my operations team member. Operations team member may need read-only access, admins may need administrative contributor access. So you will need to think of this. These are my best practices. These are my food for thought, because I'm taking into consideration all of it. Okay, then comes the pricing, which is very important. And pricing is directly related to amount of ingested data, which is daily and monthly plus retention. So that's the another decision factor that I will be taking. That what is my pricing for the service? Because based on the pricing, I will be taking this decision. If I know and pricing has budget in mind, so you already have some budget that you have bifurcated for this service. Whether that budget is in comparison of an existing service that you already have. Let's say ArcSight, you're planning migration from ArcSight. You need to identify the TCO for ArcSight, total cost of ownership for ArcSight, that what is my TCO for ArcSight, what was my capex and opex for ArcSight, and collectively it makes the TCO. Similarly, you will need to identify the TCO, total cost of ownership, for Sentinel. So pricing, very important factor. Now it has absolutely nothing to do with security, but this is very important factor because this will make or break your project. So pricing is very important. So these are the decisions. These are the decisions that you will need to make, and basis on the outcome of this decision, your workspace will be created. And this workspace is Sentinel Workspace or Log Analytics Workspace. Right now, we are not focusing on performance monitoring, network monitoring, infrastructure monitoring. Our focus is on security monitoring. So when I say workspace, I would basically mean Sentinel Workspace. And this Sentinel Workspace is nothing but Log Analytics Workspace. So these are my Sentinel Workspace design best practice, or I would say considerations, because basis on this, I will be able to take a decision. So now what Microsoft has done, Microsoft is providing you a decision tree also, which was not available earlier. Earlier, we have to take this decision. I still remember a couple of customer facing meetings wherein I am standing at the whiteboard and I am writing this down on the whiteboard, everything, and I'm helping the customer to explain what these factors are and how decision needs to be taken. And then in the end, I will agree on a decision with the customer. And there's a person who is making notes, and then the person will send the MOM to the customer at the end of the meeting, get the approval from the customer, and then this discussion goes into the high level design document, HLD. So that's what we would do, because we did not have any supporting documentation from Microsoft, but now Microsoft has a design decision tree. It has a decision tree for it. So I'll show you the decision tree. But before we get into the decision tree, let's understand this. So then there is another one last, which is new or existing workspace. This is the one last consideration, which is that there's a high probability that you are considering Sentinel today. However, you already have Azure monitoring in place. You already are monitoring. You already are leveraging Azure Monitor Service or Log Analytics Service for logging and monitoring. So if that is the case, then definitely you have an existing workspace, and that existing workspace may already have logs getting ingested from various data sources, the data sources that you will need to monitor using Sentinel. If that is the case, then should you be using an existing workspace or new workspace? This is another design consideration that you need to decide. So in what scenario you will be using new, in what scenario you will be using existing, it differs. I'm saying there is a high probability that your existing workspace contains both production and non-production data, but you have taken a decision that you would only want to monitor production data using Sentinel, then definitely you're going to create a new workspace. If you have decided that you would want to monitor, a specific, you would want to monitor data sources or application belonging to a specific business unit and function, not the entire company as a whole, then you will be creating a new workspace. So this is how you will be taking a decision. Regulatory standard and compliance. Europe, new workspace. Admin operations, IAM. Maybe the existing workspace that you have will require, is already accessed by multiple team, I'm saying NOC teams, as well as infrastructure monitoring team, database monitoring team. There are multiple monitoring team or people that have access to this existing workspace, and you cannot curtail access. You cannot restrict access. You will not be allowed to do that. There will be a hue and cry situation in the company. If you try and restrict access here, people will start to use their position. I'm saying people will feel offended. They will get offended. If you feel that there could be some, something similar may happen, you need to avoid that hiccup. Create a new workspace. Because see, at the end of the day, you are a vendor, you are a consultant, you have a timeline with which you need to complete this project. You don't want any hiccups or troubles at the customer side because of your decision. Now, some decisions are mandatory. You need to take it. For example, security. This decision cannot be overpowered by anything, any politics or any hiccup at the customer side. But some decisions are easy to take. For example, new or existing workspace. You know there is a workspace you can use, but you will need to deploy security controls. They will not allow you to do that. There will be a lengthy approval process that will get triggered, which may somehow derail your milestones, your timelines. Let's not get into that. So let's be political here. Let's be diplomatic here. Go with a new workspace. Because that's, as an architect, you are deciding. See, this decision is taken by the architect, the one who are architecting the solution. And architects are the senior most people in the team. So you will need to take the decision accordingly. Now, the other decision could be based on the ingestion also. For example, in the existing workspace, now the existing workspace, you are ingesting data for monitoring. And if you use the existing workspace, you will enable additional configuration to ingest the security data also, event log data also, syslog data also. How will you segregate? What if your company uses chargeback? What if your company has the process of charging back to specific business units and functions for the consumption that they make? Then let's not get into this trouble. Create a new workspace. So create a new workspace, enable the data sources, and whatever is the per month daily or per month ingestion, your finance team can easily charge back the security team or the security function, which will then be divided across among the business units, because security is needed by everyone, or the business and functions whose applications and data sources are getting monitored by Sentinel. So this is another consideration. So depending on the ingestion also. So these are some of the considerations. We'll continue with this. Let's take a break for 10 minutes. Is my screen visible to everyone?
Yes, it is visible.
Okay, great. So let's, with the help of this decision tree, let's design our workspace architecture, Sentinel Workspace architecture, which is the first step to build the Sentinel. Okay, so this decision tree will be asking you a certain questions, and basis on the answer of those questions, you will be able to put together a design for the workspace. For example, the first question is, do you have an existing workspace that you might use for Microsoft Sentinel? Do you have an existing workspace? If yes, will all the data in the existing workspace be consumed by the SOC team? Now you have an existing workspace, and the next question is, will all the data from that workspace will be consumed by the SOC team, which means, does that workspace not contain any typical infrastructure, network, database, application monitoring data? If the answer is yes, that the entire data will be consumed by SOC team, then we'll proceed to next step. However, if the answer is no, that no, not the entire data will be consumed by the SOC team, which means the next question is that then what is that type of data which is there in the workspace? Or if you want to quantify that data, is the ingestion data for the existing workspace is more than 100 GB per day? So if it is more than 100 GB per day that you are already ingesting in your existing workspace, then it is recommended to proceed with, it is not recommended to enable Microsoft Sentinel on an existing workspace, proceed to step 2, which basically means that if you have an existing workspace, but that workspace also contains data sets coming from various other aspects, and the approximate size of the data set is more than 100 GB per day, then you should not use that workspace. You should create a new workspace for Sentinel so that you can bifurcate the cost. You can isolate the cost of Sentinel with the rest of the initiatives, infrastructure, network monitoring, application monitoring initiatives. And also you can take advantage of the Sentinel plans. Sentinel has cost saving plans available for log analytics workspace or the Sentinel workspace. Give me a moment. All right. So if the existing workspace contains data sets and the approximate ingestion volume is more than 100 GB per day, don't go for the existing workspace, go for a new workspace. Create a new workspace, which is step number 2. So now that we have decided that we want to create new workspace. So my step number 2 is, now, do you have regulatory requirements to keep data in different Azure geographies? So now that we have decided that we'll be creating a separate workspace for Sentinel, then comes the regulatory questions. That, okay, are we creating separate workspace, but do we have data coming from various geographies? And if yes, do I need to adhere to some compliances, some regulatory requirement? For example, if my data set is coming from outside of US, from multiple geographies, then I don't need to bother about it. However, if my data set is coming from Europe, then I will need to bother about it. So the same question, that do I have any regulatory requirement that forces me to keep data in different Azure geographies? Yes, I have a regulatory requirement. Then I will use a separate Microsoft Sentinel workspace for each Azure region that has compliance requirements. So I'll keep a separate workspace. Now, here are 2 things that you need to understand. First is log data, and second is metadata. Now, log data comes from data sources, and you already know what data sources are. Your virtual machines, your networking devices, your endpoints, all those are data sources. And metadata, what metadata is? Analyzed data. That's what metadata is. Now you already know that metadata can either be kept in East US or Europe. I'm saying East Europe, East US and Europe. That's for metadata. However, these data sources, the location for these data sources could be at multiple locations, because you already see that Sentinel service is available. Log analytics is in GA in multiple locations. So the answer that you will take for this question is you will need to consider both the scenarios here. It is not that you know that, and that it is not that you know that metadata is configured. I'm saying metadata is in US and log data across multiple decisions that you decide to keep same workspace for all the locations. No, if you have operations in India, in US, in Australia, in Canada, these are different geographies, or let's say different continents. So you will need to make sure that you create at least one workspace in each geography. This is the best practice. Definitely when you have multiple workspaces, your administrative overhead will increase, However, this will simplify the architecture in the long run. It will not complicate it. If you keep one workspace for all the regions except Europe, this approach also has no drawback here, no challenge here. I mean, say from the security perspective, no challenge. But then you will have data collated in the same workspace from multiple geographies. It will be difficult for you to bifurcate or differentiate or isolate the data. That is the challenge with the first. So the best practice says that you should create one workspace in each geography. So if you have, and it also depends on the number of data sources. So for example, let's say your company is a US multinational. In US, you have, let's say 200 virtual machines. Okay. And you have recently started doing business in India. Now in India, you recently started doing business and there are only 5 VMs in India. Will I be creating a workspace in India? No. I would rather ingest logs from these 5 virtual machines in the existing workspace, which I'm using for those 200 VMs. That's the another consideration that you need to take. So though I say that you should create one workspace in each geography, but it is directly dependent on the amount or volume of data which is coming from that geography. If you feel that only limited data sources are there, very substantial number, do not create a workspace for that geography. Then you should rather use an existing workspace in the nearby geography. Okay, then comes the pricing part, which is very important for you to understand. See, these are all, architecture and design discussions, which may get overwhelming at moments, but the best part is session is getting recorded. You can review this recording later on, and this will help you in the long run also. So then comes the pricing part. Now imagine I have a workspace in US, and in this workspace, I'm ingesting data from India. So my log sources, though they are substantial, my log sources are in India, and I've decided to create a workspace in US, and the entire data from India is getting ingested into the US. Okay, so you will need to look for the pricing also, because you will need to identify the size of this data. You will pay two factors. There are two factors here that you are paying for. First is the ingestion volume. For example, the log sources in India collectively create, let's say, 5 GB of data. That's the 5 GB logs per day. Now, what are you paying for? So you are paying for 5 GB of logs per day in the US workspace, which is approximately 150 GB per month. Plus, you are also paying charges for transferring 5 GB of logs all the way from India to US. This also you need to consider. So you will need to check for egress charges also, that what will be my egress charges here. Am I making sense, guys? Is it making sense? That what is the replication of keeping one workspace and then ingesting logs from all over the world except Europe in that workspace? This is the replication that you need to be aware of. That when you are ingesting the logs, you're also paying for the networking charges, because you are transferring data all the way from India to US, all the way from Europe, Canada, and Australia to US. So the egress charges you also need to pay, other than the log ingestion charges, because the logs are going to be stored in US workspace. So you will be paying the pricing for the US workspace as well as the egress charging. This is another consideration that you need to keep in mind. So you will need to do a lot of permutations and combinations for the pricing to see whether this will make sense. I mean, say whether creating a separate workspace in India makes sense from pricing perspective, or whether choosing a central workspace in another country and sending logs from India will make sense from pricing perspective. And it's a trade-off between administrative effort and pricing. Because if you create multiple workspaces, definitely your administrative efforts are going to increase. If you keep one workspace, your administrative effort will be low, but your cost may get high. You may end up, mixing everything at one place and then finding it difficult to segregate it when it is needed. So it's a trade-off. You will need to take decision accordingly. And decision will not be based on what you think is right. It also has an iota of what your customer think is right or what your customer has a mandate. So that's what you need to decide on the workspace strategy when you end up deciding that, okay, I'm going to create a new workspace, then how many workspace? So this is the data source. And then comes the analyze data. Analyze data has no relevance as long as there is no regulatory restrictions. Because analyze data, Sentinel will not charge you for the analyzed data. The metadata that it stores in US or in Europe, there is no charges for it. That is included in the Sentinel services. So there is no charges here, but there are charges here. So you need to keep that in mind. So this is your another decision that you need to take into consideration. So yes, if you are using a separate workspace for each Azure region that has compliance requirement, take into consideration the pricing and administrative pricing factor and administrative overhead that you may end up, building. So that's the another decision that you need to make. Then comes the third, which is how complex your environment is. Now, we were talking about so far, we were just focusing on a single tenant and single multiple subscription architecture. So the customer has single tenant, single Azure AD tenant, and single or multiple subscriptions in that tenant architecture. This was the decision that, okay, we are creating one workspace, multiple workspaces. But now I'm trying to, let's complicate it a bit further. Let's imagine that your customer has multi Azure AD tenant and multiple subscription environment. So if you have a single Azure AD tenant and single or one or two subscription architecture, we are okay. We can move on to the next step in the decision tree. But if we have multiple Azure AD tenant, then you will need to also consider that how are you collecting the logs, because the tenants are isolated. I would say tenants are isolated. Now, before you understand this. For example, let's say I have two subscriptions, subscription A and subscription B in the same tenant. Now I can create a LA workspace in subscription A, and I can have my data source in subscription B also. I'm saying I have two subscriptions, which means I have data sources in both the subscriptions that I want to monitor. Let's say virtual machines in both the subscriptions that I want to monitor for performance and syslog. I'm saying for event and syslog. So what I can do, I can create my log analytics workspace in any of the subscription, and the other subscription data sources can be configured to send log to the log analytics workspace in the other subscription, provided if both the subscriptions are part of the same tenant. This is the architectural consideration. However, if I have multiple tenants, and each tenant, let's say I have multiple tenants, I have tenant A, which has subscription A and subscription B. I have tenant B, which has subscription C and subscription D. I'm just taking a simple scenario here. You can make it more complicated as per your requirement. So I have two tenants. Now the core concept will remain the same, whether you have 2 tenants or 20 tenants. Now you have 2 tenants here. So what you do, you want to ingest the logs for Sentinel. So you create, let's say, a workspace. You create an LA workspace in subscription B, and you are able to ingest logs from subscription A because they are in the same tenant. But what about subscription C and D? Can you ingest the logs from subscription C and D to the workspace which you have configured in subscription B of another tenant, which is tenant A? Yes, no, maybe. I'll ask the question once again. See, first understand the previous scenario wherein I have a single tenant, and in the single tenant, I have 2 subscriptions. I create log analytics workspace in subscription A, and I am able to ingest logs from both the subscriptions to this workspace, which is doable because both the tenant are part of the same subscription. So they have visibility. However, when I have multiple tenants, tenant A comprising of 2 subscriptions, tenant B comprising of 2 subscriptions, and I create a log analytics workspace in subscription B of tenant A. I know from the previous scenario that I can also ingest logs from subscription A to subscription B log analytics workspace of the same tenant. But what about the other tenant subscriptions? Can data sources, can I ingest logs from data sources of subscription C and subscription D to the log analytics workspace of tenant A and subscription B? Yes, no, maybe. When I'm presenting the screen, when I'm writing something, I will not be able to see if you are responding through the chat or through, I'm saying if you're using those options. Yes, but you will lose lots of metadata about event. Okay. The answer is actually no. Because subscriptions, I'm saying you will not have an option you will not have a direct option to ingest the logs. Why you don't have a direct option? Because do not only focus on virtual machines. We have other services from which we want to ingest logs. For example, if it is about virtual machines only, then I can directly deploy Azure Monitor Log Agent or Log Analytics Agent on the virtual machine in subscription C, which will send data to this log analytics workspace of another tenant. No challenge. But if it is about native services of subscription C, native services like network, storage accounts, databases, functions, data lake, multiple native services, PaaS services, Azure SQL DB, then I will not be able to send because it would not allow me to do that. Now I have an option. The option is I can use third party. So I can use services like Event Hub. I can use, I'm saying there are possible scenarios, there are ways, but then the challenge with this approach is a lot of complexity. There will be a lot of complexity that I'm inviting here by trying this. So what I would rather do, I have a best solution here for which I will also give you a demo, which is Lighthouse. I will be using Lighthouse here. Lighthouse is a service using which I can manage multiple tenants. And though this service is basically meant for MSSPs, managed security service providers, however, I can also use this service for my internal consumption. I'm saying using this service, I can manage multiple tenants. So those multiple tenants can also be mine as a customer. I have multiple tenants. I'm using Lighthouse, and using Lighthouse, I am actually able to manage my Sentinel deployments. So that's one of the options. And the same service can be used by, let's say, can be used by DXC to manage multiple customers. So you have 20 customers. You don't need to create 20 separate teams to manage the security monitoring for them. You can have one team with Lighthouse configured and 20 subscription, 20 tenants configured in that Lighthouse with the bifurcation of RBAC. I am saying you will need to very carefully design your IAM approach when you have multiple tenants belonging to different customers. So IAM needs to be designed very carefully, but when you design the IAM carefully, you will be able to do it. So yes, it is possible, but there are so much involved into it, and that is why the direct answer to this question is no. We should not be able to do this, but there are approaches, and Lighthouse is the service through which I can do it. But this service is also very, it is not that easy to configure. As I said, managing multiple tenants is very complicated. And that is why if I just go out of Sentinel for a moment, and if I just come to Azure architecture design for any customer, Azure architecture design best practices, it will always be single tenant, multiple subscription. And to manage multiple subscription, use management tools. This is the best practice. This is what Microsoft suggests. However, what are the scenarios in which somebody comes up with multiple tenant architecture? They come up with multiple tenant architecture in two scenarios. The first scenario is the customer themselves or their IT team themselves is not able to, they don't have clear visibility into Azure architecture design aspects, and they end up creating multiple tenants. So lack of awareness at customer side. That's the first scenario in which multiple tenant architecture exists. Lack of technical awareness, technology awareness at customer side. And second is mergers and acquisitions. When your company acquires another company who is already using Azure, definitely they have their own tenant, you have your own tenant. So you will end up merging their tenant with yours, or you will end up managing both the tenants as separate entity. So these are the two scenarios wherein you will end up doing multiple tenant architecture. And if that happens, this is an opportunity. This is actually an opportunity for an MSP. Because now this MSP will be called like DXC. DXC will be invited by the customer stating that, you know what, we are just not able to manage the show here because we end up having multiple tenants. Now we are managing permissions, we are managing redundant identities. There's a lot of trouble because of which there are security incidents. So it's an opportunity for DXC to go and say, okay, we will help you consolidate the architecture. So you will help them consolidate the architecture, which means you will try and identify a tenant as root tenant and merge rest of the tenants with that tenant. So you will consolidate the architecture, and by consolidating the architecture, it means your end picture will be this. Your outcome will be this, that you will end up having single tenant with multiple subscriptions. So all the subscriptions of the other tenant will be moved into a single tenant that you will decide as your main tenant. So that's the consolidate the architecture is the opportunity for MSPs. And this is where you make a lot of money. A lot of money is involved here because not everyone has the knowledge and experience to take care of projects of these complexities, because this requires a lot of movement, a lot of downtime and commercials and finances from the customer, and not everyone has the capability to do it. So if you want to know who are the players who can help you with consolidating the architecture, there is a partner portal on Azure which houses Azure expert MSPs. So you have Azure expert MSPs till 2019. No. So I was. Okay. Yep. Mid of 2018, there were only 7 MSPs in the world. Now, at present in 2023, there will be 100 plus across the world. Only 7 MSPs were there in 2018. So Azure came up with this Azure Expert MSP badge, which contains some requirements for MSP to be certified as Azure Expert MSP. So only 7 companies, 7 ISVs, they had this badge, and I was lucky to be part of 2 of them. One, I actually helped them with Azure Expert MSP certification. Navisite is the name. And now in 2023, there are 100 plus MSPs, because now it is not that difficult, or the companies, the MSPs have realized the importance of this badge. So they all applied for it. They got the required capabilities inbuilt into their processes, and then they were able to get the coveted Azure Expert MSP badge. So this is outside of Sentinel, but this is equally important for you to understand, because there are times when you are able to, when you go to deploy a solution for a customer and you're able to deploy it with very easiness, there is absolutely no challenge. But there are times when you have a lot of prerequisites that needs to be fixed. And this could be one of the prerequisites that you may end up telling the customer that, you know what, you've got multiple tenants. We would rather suggest you to do the consolidation. So before Sentinel, let us give this opportunity to first consolidate and then deploy the Sentinel as a second option. So this is another opportunity that you can do. So once again, when you have multiple tenants, tenants are isolated in nature. It becomes very difficult to deploy, to design Sentinel environment, because it involves a lot of complexity, and it involves a lot of restrictions in terms of RBAC. So the idea is to centralize, if possible, do the go ahead and do the centralization, which is consolidate the architecture. If consolidation is not possible, then you will need to go with multiple workspace design. So this is where you will create multiple workspaces. Definitely, it would not make sense. It is not commercially viable also to ingest logs across tenant. It is not commercially viable also, because it would involve some cost and administrative overhead. So I would rather suggest you to keep it simple, because implementation you don't do every day. So go with separate workspace. It would be easier for you in the long run. But if you go with the multiple tenants, then I would rather suggest you to go with Lighthouse. But Lighthouse service was only introduced in 3-4 years ago. But this concept, this multiple tenant architecture, or this trouble was there right from the beginning. So Lighthouse service has its own, I'm say, drawbacks, or let's say there are some issues with Lighthouse service, which Microsoft continuously working to fix it. But you can use this service, and this service is primarily used by MSSPs, which are which are managing multiple customers for their security monitoring. So this is what we can do here. Okay. So we are done with the third stage, which is to decide whether I have single tenant or multiple tenant architecture. Okay. Then comes my fourth step, which is the most important part, which is money. Billing. At the end of the day, your customer will blame you if they get overcharged by Microsoft, or if the picture that you have shown in the ROI and TCO to convince them, to influence them to go for Sentinel, if that picture comes blurry in the end, if they get more than what they were promised or what they initially was expecting. So billing and chargeback is very important. So the question is that, do you need to split your billing or chargeback across multiple business units and divisions and functions? If yes, would the usage reporting or manual cross charge work for you? Will you be able to put in some administrative overhead of doing the usage reporting. I mean, say Sentinel will provide you log analytics workspace has the capability to separate logs basis on data sources and basis on certain tags also, which belongs to a specific department or function. And it also has the capability of providing you usage reporting. So if usage reporting and segregation makes sense to you, if it makes sense to you, then you will need to move to the next step. If it doesn't make sense to you, then the same thing. Use a separate Microsoft Sentinel workspace for each cost owner. So if you don't want to get into the reporting, if you don't want to get into the administrative overhead of creating the bifurcation between data sources belonging to various departments, because you want to charge back them, then go ahead and use a separate workspace. And if you are ready to do it, then go for the consolidated workspace. Okay. Okay. Then comes my step 5, which is again very important, may not be applicable to everyone, which is, am I connecting any non-SOC data? Now, SOC is a compliance which is applicable to entities which are registered, which are publicly listed, entities which invite citizens or outsiders to invest into the business and become a stakeholder. So they had been given certain responsibilities because they are accountable to their shareholders, their stakeholders. And for that, they need to ensure some transparency into the business. If you remember the very infamous case of Mahindra Satyam, guys, do you remember the case of Satyam? Long time back, some 10, 15 years ago, there used to be a company with the name Satyam. Does anybody remember that case? Okay. So there used to be a company with the name Satyam, an IT company. What that company did, they intentionally inflated their account books and showed it to their stakeholders that they are a profitable organization, while the fact was they were running in losses. But they showed it in their account books that they are profitable, and they continued doing it. And the management of the company was kind of keeping that money with themselves, and the company was really in a bad shape. And one fine day, it came to light. And since it had interest of citizens, there were multiple shareholders and stakeholders. The government intervened, and then the government, took control of the company. Later on, the company was acquired by Tech Mahindra, and now that entity does not even exist. It is Mahindra only. Mahindra completely scrapped that name and acquired everything into their logo. But that gave a lesson, and that was the alarming factor for the government of India. And that's how it all started. So from that incident, the government came up with Competition Commission of India, CCI, which is a body which looks into competition, which looks into the various practices adopted by various businesses in India. And it also looks into the aspects of data. And then the audit, CAG got started for the private listed companies as well. The audit got started. Prior to that, there was no audit for private listed companies. It was only done for the government entities. So a lot of changes were brought in by the government to ensure that something similar will not happen in future, because government incurred a lot of losses because they wanted to protect the interest of the citizens. So that is where SOC comes into the picture. That SOC is a kind of control. SOC 1, 2, and 2, they are the control and compliances which contain certain controls. And if there's a situation that you are connecting any SOC data, then you will need to ensure that the data does not overlap. Or I can say that if you are bound by SOC, I'm saying every company knows that whether they need to be complying with SOC or not. If you need to comply with SOC, make sure you create a separate workspace. Simple. Let's not get into the complication of it. The answer is simple. If there's a SOC compliance, create a separate workspace. Do not use the same workspace that you are using for other functions. Create a separate workspace if it is SOC, because the auditors will come and ask for the data. So that's the SOC answer, that if there are ever overlapping, then create a separate workspace. Okay. Then comes the other step, which is if you want to combine SOC and non-SOC, which is, for example, if you are a multinational company, now in one geography you could be SOC compliant, in other geography you are not SOC compliant, because for that geography you're not listed. For example, multinationals from India. When multinationals from India, they are listed in Nifty and BSE, Bombay Stock Exchange and Nifty. However, when they start operating in US, they are not listed in NYSE or any Dow Jones Captiva or any the local body there. So they are not listed, then they are not compliant in that geography, but they are compliant in India. So if you are into a situation wherein you have businesses across multiple geographies and you are compliant at one geography but not at the other geography, then what you need to do? Or when you are collecting logs from multiple regions. So this I already explained. Would the data egress cost be a major concern with a higher priority to reduce than the my first, if you have this situation wherein in one geography you have SOC, in the other geography you don't have SOC, which I worked on a project. So in that scenario, again, separate the workspace. Separate the workspace for SOC and non-SOC data. That will help you in the long run when the audit happens. Because for SOC compliant businesses, audit happens once in a year, and it's an external audit that happens. So the auditors would want to look into that security data. I'm saying that's the mandate for a SOC compliant business to have a security monitoring in place, SOC in place, and the auditors will look into the SOC data when they do the audit. So you need to have that data separate. It should not happen. They're asking for data A and you're providing them with data A plus B plus C and D. Why? Because you have everything into the same workspace. No. So keep a separate workspace. Now, when you need to collect logs from multiple regions, as I gave you the example that you decide to go with a single workspace in US, but logs are coming from India, Australia, and Canada also. So you need to be careful about the egress cost also, because egress cost could be a major concern. So look at the pricing, that what will be the per GB ingestion egress cost, and accordingly identify the approximate amount of daily ingestion data and calculate it and then compare it with setting up workspace in the same region or setting up workspace across region and then ingesting the logs to the Sentinel service in the other region. So that's the another consideration that you need to keep. So if it is a major concern for you, egress cost, then use a separate workspace for each region where you need to reduce the data egress cost. So that's the another. So with this decision tree, all the questions that comes to your mind, or all the questions that comes to your customer's mind, or all the questions that needs to be answered, or all the scenarios that needs to be taken into consideration will be included here. So this is a great decision tree that Microsoft has put together. Earlier it was all done manually, as I was explaining you on the whiteboard or on the Word document. Okay, next, do you need to control data access by data source table in Microsoft Sentinel? Now, as I have told you the last week, that when you enable the data sources or when you install a connector, a table is created. Inside the table, a table is created inside the log analytics, and inside the table, logs are ingested. Logs are maintained inside the table. When you run a query, that query goes to the table and brings the data. So the question is that, do you want to control the data access? So forget about table for a moment. Just think from the access management perspective, that I have a solution in place. I have 20 team members with varying responsibilities, varying job role and functions related to that solution. Will I be granting them the same level of access? If the answer is no, then focus on RBAC. Forget about table for a moment. Focus on RBAC, that what will be the level of access that I will be granting. So, and we have done the same thing. We have created 2 security groups, one for admin and one for operations team. And if you remember, we have granted read-only reader RBAC to the operations team and contributor RBAC to the admin team. However, when it comes to Sentinel admin team, instead of granting them contributor RBAC on the subscription, which gives them complete access to other services, you would rather grant them contributor access on the log analytics workspace or the resource group which contains the log analytics workspace. Because log analytics workspace is your data repository that Sentinel needs to work with. So you will give them the access on the log analytics workspace, contributor access, administrative access, or the specific access. And then Sentinel also has a RBAC. So you will decide the specific RBAC from Sentinel also. So if I go to subscription, you will see the RBAC for Sentinel. So you will need to pick and choose these RBACs. These RBACs did not exist in the past. As I said, Microsoft is improving the service. So now you have RBAC for Sentinel also. So these are the RBACs for Sentinel you can see. So Microsoft Sentinel Automation Contributor, Microsoft Sentinel Contributor, Microsoft Sentinel Playbook Operator, Microsoft Sentinel Reader, and Microsoft Sentinel Responder. Now, reader is somebody who is L1, somebody who needs to read the information from Sentinel console and send the input to the level 2 team. Responder is somebody who should have the capability to change the incident type. I'm saying if it is a new incident, it is in progress, incident stage. So responder is somebody like L2, somebody who needs more capability. Then there are admin team people, like somebody who is responsible for writing automation use cases and integrating those use cases with various analytics rules. So somebody who needs capability to work at the logic app service. So this is where you need playbook operator. Then comes another role, which is Microsoft Sentinel contributor. Now this is the actual admin, somebody who has done the architecture, design, and somebody who's also responsible for the upgrade, maintenance, and enhancement of the service capability. So Sentinel contributor, somebody who has contributor access. If you want to see what contributor can do, what are the specific capabilities, you just need to click on view, and view will show you the permissions that the person has. So these are the permissions that the person has. You can see read permissions, other permissions. And if you want to keep it simple, go to the JSON. JSON will give you everything. So JSON, here in JSON, you can see that the person has query action permissions. You will see all the permissions that the person has. So these are the permissions. So wherever you see star against a permission, for example, you can see star here. Now here you see star everywhere. So you can see Microsoft security inside star, which means everything at star. Sentinel Workspace read star, write star. Wherever it says star, it means that the person has all the capabilities. However, since this is contributor, this has all the capabilities. But if you go to the responder and look at the JSON of responder, you will see that you will not find stars there. You will find specific capability written. Now you can see you will not have more stars here. Since it is a responder, definitely the person has all the capability to manage the incidents. So star, which means changing the priority of the incident, changing the type of incident, stage of incident, doing everything with respect to the cases, but not all the actions. For example, here you can see workspace read query. Here the person will only have read access. So workspace query read access. So the permissions will change and you will see not actions. This person is not able to do these operations. For example, this person cannot delete any cases, any incident, anything. This person cannot delete the incident. This person cannot delete the confidential watch list. This person cannot query the confidential watch list. So not actions. So Microsoft Sentinel has RBAC also available. And by using these RBACs, one of these RBACs, you will be able to grant access to identities, which will help you with this step, which is the access part, that how do I want to control the access. So do you need to control data access by data source table in Microsoft? Yes. So it says, does resource context RBAC fits your environment? Yes. Use a single Microsoft workspace or separate. So you can configure access at the table level also. So accordingly, you will take a decision. And if the answer to all the questions that I have started asking from top, I'm saying if that was no, 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 then in the end, you have a decision, which is use a single Microsoft Sentinel workspace. If none of that, if you fall in none of those cases, then you will use a single Sentinel workspace. So this is how you basically infer the decision tree, which is provided by Microsoft for designing the Sentinel architecture. Let me know if you have any questions here, guys. This comprises all the use cases, all the design questions and considerations, that you may think of with respect to Sentinel design. After this, I will show you a couple of sample workspace design best practices and design architectures. Any question, guys? Complete silence. Majority of the participants on day one share their learning objective, as they want to understand the administrative part. This is the administrative part. It all starts with design and architecture. Understanding what is there in the, I'm saying, knowing only this aspect is not sufficient. If you know only this, which is if you only know the meaning of all of these options which are there inside the portal, is not sufficient. That is not administrative task only. Understanding what happens prior to this is also equally important, because what happens prior to this has a great influence here on these options that you configure later on after enabling the service. So that part is very important. What happens behind the scene is very important for you to understand. Okay, let's see some sample designs here. Now, Microsoft uses a tenant with the name Contoso, a domain with the name Contoso, which Microsoft maintains for for showcasing any design considerations, or users can also use Contoso domain when they are configuring the hands-on lab environment, or when they are configuring anything in non-production environment. So these are some design architectures. Now, for example, you can see the first design, which is multiple tenants and regions. This is my complex design. Now you can see here in this design, it says due to an acquisition several years ago, Contoso has 2 Azure AD tenants. Now what happens? It is taking an example of a customer. Let's say Contoso is the name of the customer. Now Contoso organization did some acquisitions, and because of that acquisition, they ended up having multiple tenants. So we have 2 tenants here, Contoso tenant, and we have wingtip tenant. So there are 2 tenants here. Now both the tenants has its own Office 365 instances. I'm saying both the tenants, both the companies are using M365 services, which is Microsoft SaaS service, and they also have multiple subscriptions. So they have, for example, in this tenant, you have 4 subscriptions, and they also have multiple management groups. I'm saying they have multiple subscriptions which are collated across management groups for the purpose of reducing the administrative effort. And same is the case with Wingtip also. They also have the same architecture. Now, when this is the design, when this is the scenario, how are you going to design your Sentinel workspace? So now, with this design in place, with this situation or architecture in place, it gives you the guidance that how do you need to design. So before you need to design, you need to understand the requirement. So it also makes it more complicated by saying that we have compliance requirements. So it says Contoso currently has Azure resources in 3 different regions: Europe, Japan, which is ASTA. So it has US, Europe, and Asia Pacific, West Japan, and strict requirements to keep all data generated in Europe within the European regions. And strict requirements only with Europe, because you already know GDPR is there. Rest of the geographies, it is not that important, not that strict. Now, both of Contoso's Azure AD tenants have resources in all the 3 regions: in Europe, North Europe, and Japan. East Europe, I'm saying US East, Europe, and Japan. With this architecture, you will understand the most difficult part, and then rest of them will be very easy for you to understand. Now let's understand. So you've understood the architecture, you've understood the compliance requirements. Now let's understand the Sentinel requirements, that what Contoso as a customer is expecting out of Sentinel, what capabilities needs from the Sentinel. So the capability is that Contoso needs to collect events from both following data sources: Office 365 from both the tenants, Azure AD sign-in and audit logs, it is from both the tenants, Azure activity, Windows security events from both on-premises and Azure VM resources, syslog from both on-premises and Azure VM resources, CEF from multiple on-premises networking devices, and multiple Azure PaaS services such as Azure Firewall. It also needs log from these services. Now, Azure VMs are mostly located in EU North region, with only a few in US East and West Japan. It is giving you another, input that it needs logs from these. And when it comes to the VMs are primarily located in Europe. Most of the VMs are in Europe for both the domains, for both the entities. However, some VMs are also located in Japan and East US. And Contoso uses Microsoft Defender for servers on all the Azure VMs. That's the another input that you get. That Contoso has enabled Microsoft Defender for cloud in all the, in all the subscriptions inside the tenant, and all the virtual machines are getting monitored through Defender for cloud, which is Defender for server is part of Defender for cloud. Now, Contoso expect to ingest around 300 GB data from all their data sources. This 300 GB includes both Contoso as well as Wingtip and all the data sources. This is the expectation on the pricing part. It should not go beyond 300 GB per day. Okay. Now the access requirements. So it says Contoso Azure environment already has a single existing log analytics workspace used by operations team to monitor the infrastructure. So over here in the Contoso, here in one of the subscription, they have a log analytics workspace, and using that workspace, they are monitoring the infrastructure. I'm saying virtual machine, network security group, storage account, and all that. They're already monitoring it. The workspace is located in Contoso Azure AD tenant within Europe North region. So that workspace is in North Europe region and is being used to collect logs from Azure VMs in all the regions. They currently ingest around 50 GB data per day. So in this architecture, the left side of the architecture, they have a workspace in Europe, and using that workspace, they are collecting the logs from all the VMs. Now, when I say all the VMs, it also includes the VMs in Japan and US. And the per day log ingestion is around 50 GB per day. The Contoso operations team needs to have access to all the logs that are currently have in the workspace, which includes several data not needed by the SOC, such as perf insights, container logs, and more. The operations team must not have access to the new logs that are collected in Microsoft Sentinel. So the other requirement is, since they already are using a log analytics workspace here for the infrastructure monitoring perspective, they have an operations team, and that operations team already have access to data, but they don't need any SOC data because they are not doing security monitoring. And also, when you enable Sentinel here, you need to ensure that your operations team, the infrastructure monitoring team, should not have access to the Sentinel data. That's the requirement. that the operations team must not have access. Now, what solution are you putting here? So here's the solution that you can see here. This is the solution. So the solution is that following steps apply the Microsoft Workspace design decision tree. So you have 7-8 steps there, and it has basically shown you the answers from those steps based on this scenario. So now the first step was, since they already have an existing workspace, so we can explore enabling Microsoft Sentinel in that same workspace. Sentinel, they will enable in the same workspace in the Contoso. And non-SOC data ingestion is less than 100 GB per day. So we can continue to step 2 because their current ingestion is 50 GB per day. You can see here. So they can move to step number 2. Okay. Then it says Contoso have regulatory requirements. So we need at least one Microsoft Sentinel workspace in Europe. So since they have regulatory requirement in Europe, so they already have one Sentinel workspace in Europe because they are going to use the existing workspace, and that workspace is already in Europe. So they are protected by the regulatory requirement as well. Third, they have 2 different Azure AD tenants and collect logs from tenant level data sources like Office 365, Azure AD sign-ins, and audit logs. So we need at least one workspace per tenant. Now this is where you can understand that since tenants are isolated in nature, what they are doing, they are creating a separate workspace per tenant. So what they are doing here in the solution, if you see, they are creating, this is your workspace, operational workspace, which is separate, and this is Microsoft Sentinel. So in this operational workspace, they are containing the M365 logs, Azure AD sign-in logs in this workspace for this tenant. And over here, they also have a workspace in which they are collecting the logs here. Okay. Then comes Contoso does not need chargeback, so we can continue with step 5. So they don't need chargeback, so they can use, so there is no chargeback question here. So they can directly use a single workspace for both operational as well as security monitoring related data, and RBAC will be applied to restrict the operations team to not being able to see the data of the security team and vice versa, because your security team also does not need to see the data of operations team, which is infrastructure monitoring. So they're saying that we are good, we don't need chargeback, so we can continue with step 5. Then Contoso does need to collect non-SOC data. Although there aren't any overlap between SOC and non-SOC data, also SOC data accounts approximately 2 GB, 3. So the total expectation is 300 GB per day. So here is 50 GB per day is their non-security data, typical monitoring data. So they can have up to 250 GB per day of ingestion across tenant for the SOC data. So they should use separate workspace for the sake of cost efficiency. Most Contoso VMs are in the US. Now let's look at the compliance part. So because most of the VMs are in Europe North region, where they have already a workspace. Therefore, in this case, bandwidth cost isn't a concern. So there is no concern with the bandwidth because majority of the VMs are already in Europe. They already have those VMs log ingested into Europe. All they need to enable is the additional log collection for security logs they need to basically collect, because they're already collecting the infrastructure logs for those VMs. Then Contoso has a single SOC team. Now this is where they have a single SOC team that will be using Microsoft Sentinel. So no extra separation is needed. So same SOC team will be needing it. Now it says all members of the Contoso SOC team will have access to all the data. So no extra separation is needed. So since it is one company and they have a common team which will manage and maintain the data, so they don't need any separation. So the resulting Microsoft Sentinel Workspace design for Contoso is illustrated in the following example. So this is the resulting design. Now what is happening here? It says the suggested solution includes this. It is a separate log analytics workspace for the Contoso operations team. Separate log analytics workspace. This workspace will only contain data that's not needed by Contoso SOC team. So what it says, this design does not show you the workspace for the security team. I said this is an anomaly here, or this is the shortcoming of this image. Because what you see here, the operational workspace, this workspace is basically for the operations team, not for the SOC team. So it says a separate log analytics workspace for the Contoso operations team. This workspace will only contain data that's not needed by Contoso SOC team, such as this data, perf, insight matrix, and container logs. 2 Microsoft Sentinel workspaces, one in each Azure AD tenant. Now this portion is not shown in this image. 2 Microsoft Sentinel workspaces. So in both the tenants, there will be a separate workspace for Microsoft Sentinel, which will collate all the Sentinel related data, which includes M365 logs, Azure AD logs, and the event logs, security event logs from various VMs inside these subscriptions, which will go into this workspace here. Something which is not shown in this image. And then all other data coming from on-premises data sources can be routed to one of the 2 Microsoft Sentinel workspaces. Now we also had on-premises flavor here. So you can choose any of this workspace, I'm saying any of this tenant, and the workspace inside the tenant to have log data from on-premises ingested. That you can do in any of them, whether you choose Contoso or Wingtip. So that's what Microsoft is suggesting as a solution based on the design considerations that I have put together and we have seen in the decision tree. Let me know if you have any questions while you are looking at this image. Just imagine that we have 2 separate workspaces, one in each tenant also existing, which is for the SOC team, something which is not shown here. And at this moment, they are not using Lighthouse.
Hi, Raghuveer.
Yes.
Yeah, I have a question here. Can we increase the size of the data ingestion storage here? It is, I have seen here it is 300 GB fixed. Can we increase that, or it is fixed only? It is 300 GB.
No, that is the expectation from the client. So Contoso's expectation is that we should not go beyond 300 GB per day log ingestion. That's the expectation. When you enable data sources, you will also on daily basis monitor that what is my per day data ingestion. And if you feel that it is going beyond 300 GB, now that 300 GB also includes 50 GB of operations team. I'm saying the typical infrastructure monitor. So you are left with 250 GB. Now, whenever you feel by looking at ingestion data over a period of time, let's say daily, once in a week, once in a month, if you feel that it is going beyond 250 GB, then you will need to optimize the solution by reducing the log volume. Then you will need to look into your data sources and see what all data you are collecting. If it is really important to collect all the data, can we identify some data sources which are not needed? If yes, let's remove those data sources and reduce the overall log ingestion. But if the answer is no, that we have already done the fine tuning and housekeeping work, this is the bare minimum data that we need to ingest. And the approximate or the average daily data ingestion is 300 GB or let's say 350 GB. Then you will need to get into the discussion with the customer and show it to the customer that we are already ingesting bare minimum data. And even though the log volume is coming as 300 or 350 GB per day, let's increase the budget. So this is how you should take the decision. Make sense?
Yeah, got it. Thank you.
Yeah. Any other question, guys? Even if you are part of operations team and you don't get to do it, this is a very good to know information, because when you are handling the operations for your customer today, when you go back to your Sentinel workspace architecture and see what you can do, you will realize the design. You will realize that phase that we are discussing now, that before we got access to this environment, this environment was implemented in the past by somebody and they took into consideration all of these factors. That is why I'm only able to go to view a limited aspect of it. I have certain restrictions, and this is how it is happening because of this. So this was my first scenario, which was the most complicated scenario, wherein you have multiple tenants and multiple subscriptions, and you have seen the solution. The solution is that if you have multiple tenants and multiple subscriptions, the best practice is to have a separate workspace in each tenant for Sentinel and ingest the logs into that workspace. For on-premises, you can choose any of the workspace to ingest the logs out of those two workspaces for Sentinel. That's the design. Then my second scenario is single tenant with multiple clouds. Now, the other is single tenant. I have a single Azure AD tenant, but there are multiple clouds. When I say multiple clouds, they have AWS, they have GCP also, and they have an on-premises private cloud also, let's say. So let's understand. So now the name of the company is Fabricam. This is also used by Microsoft. It is an organization with headquarters in New York and offices all around United States. So you can see they are only present in US, and they are starting the cloud journey and still needs to deploy their first Azure landing zone, migrate their first workloads. They already have some workloads on AWS, which they intend to monitor using Microsoft Sentinel. So they are starting their journey with Azure, but they have an existing presence in AWS with some workloads, and they want to use Microsoft Sentinel for AWS also instead of using Amazon Guard Duty and Amazon Detective, which is equivalent of Sentinel in Amazon in AWS. So they have a single Azure AD tenant. Now their compliance requirements, since they have no compliance requirement because their majority of the resources are in US, but bandwidth cost across regions aren't a major concern. Then the other thing is that they are not also worried about the bandwidth cost. Why? Because they have offices across US, which means they have office in Washington, and the other office is in New York. And New York and Washington is like East Coast and West Coast. The distance is approximately 1,300, 400 miles, right? Now, when you send data from New York, East Coast to West Coast, which is Washington, there will be egress charges. So they are also not bothered about egress charges, which means now the scenario is becoming very similar, very simple for us. Or you would think that I should start with this scenario and then go to the difficult one. But my approach is all different. I start with the difficult one so that I can have you use your brain and then use the easy one, which is very simple. So here you don't have egress charges issue. Here you don't have compliance issue. And you only have one Azure AD tenant. Then it says Fabricam resources type and collection requirement. Now this is the objective requirements that they want to collect sign-in logs and audit logs. So we are already collecting these logs in our labs. We are also collecting these logs in our labs. We are also collecting these labs except on premises, but we are collecting Azure VM logs. We are also collecting Windows events for Azure VMs. We are collecting performance data also. So I'm saying our lab environment is similar to this. And I also shown you how to collect logs from AWS when I configured the AWS connector. So I have it collected here. You can see here AWS is collected here. And if you want to see what logs I'm getting from AWS, I can show you. I'm getting a lot of logs from AWS, though that nobody's working in that account. So majority of the logs are related to administrative events, which are done by AWS itself, as well as some login events that you will find there. So I'll come back to this when it is available. Okay. And then AKS audit and performance log, Azure Kubernetes Service audit and performance log. This is their requirement. Okay, access requirements. They have security events and Windows events. I'm saying their operations team needs access to security events and Windows events from both on-premises and Azure, performance data from both on-premises and Azure, AKS performance from containers and audit logs, and or Azure activity logs, which is good. Now they also need access. So this is operations team. Operations team need access to this, and SOC team need access to this. They have two separate teams. Okay, now the solution. So the solution is, since they have no existing workspace, they will create a new workspace, which is step 2. Since they have no regulatory requirement, they'll move on to the step 3. Since they have a single tenant, they'll move on to the step 4, which means they'll come to the step 8, which is create a new workspace. Since they have no need to split up charges, so continue step 5. Since they will need separate workspace for their SOC and operations team, now this is where they can take a decision. They can either create a separate workspace or they can configure RBAC at the table level, and they can have data ingested into separate tables, data for operations team in a separate table, data for SOC team in a separate table. So here both the options are given. So Fabricam operations team needs to collect performance data from VM's AKS. Since AKS is based on diagnostic settings, they can send specific logs to specific workspaces. Fabricam can choose to send AKS logs to Microsoft Sentinel Workspace and all AKS logs to a separate workspace. So it says they can choose audit logs to Sentinel and AKS logs to a separate workspace where Microsoft Sentinel isn't enabled. So what it says that they will rather have 3 workspaces or 2 workspaces, one workspace which is primarily meant for operations team and one workspace which is common for both operations and security team. For Windows VM, Fabricam can use Azure Monitoring Agent to split logs, sending security events to, now here it is using Azure Monitoring Agent. So they're creating 2 data collection rules. The first data collection rule that they are creating, in which they are only capturing the performance logs, which is for the infrastructure monitoring. And in the second data collection rule, they are capturing the syslogs and event logs, which is for Sentinel team. And Fabricam chooses to consider their overlapping data, such as now there will be some overlapping data also, which is like security events and Azure activity events, because Azure activity event also needs to be, I'm saying operations team also needs access to Azure activity events to see some data, and security team also needs Azure, Azure activity logs. So anything which is overlapping, that data will be sent to the Sentinel workspace. So what the design is that you will have 2 workspaces, one dedicated for operations team, second, which contains data for Sentinel team as well as some overlapping data, which operations team may also need access to. Then bandwidth cost is not a concern, so they'll go to the step number 8. And since they already have decided to use separate workspaces for SAC and operations team, no further separation is needed. Now Fabricam does need to control access for overlapping data. Now that's the only concern that you see here. They have 2 separate workspaces, one for operations team, which is only with operations team, no access issue. Second, Sentinel workspace, which is for both operations to a certain extent and Sentinel security team. So this is where overlapping comes into the picture. So it says security events and Azure events aren't custom logs, so Fabricam can use table level RBAC. So they can use table level RBAC to grant access to those 2 tables for the operations team. So those 2 tables where the overlapping data is there, which is the security data is there, they can create an RBAC and they can grant read-only access to that table to the operations team. That's it. And contributor access will be there with the security monitoring team on the table. Now the resulting Microsoft Sentinel Workspace design is illustrated here. So here's the resulted design, which is you can see you have AKS clusters, you have Windows servers. So you can see AKS clusters performance and audit logs go into the operational workspace, and Windows servers performance logs goes into the operation workspace. Then AKS audit logs comes into the Sentinel workspace. Security events comes here. So we have 2 workspaces, one for operations, one for Sentinel. Now the operations team, they will have RBAC onto the operational workspace, and they will have complete access or contributor access on this workspace. And the same operations team will have table level RBAC on activity logs and security events. So that's how you are managing it. So now operations team will have complete access to the operational workspace and limited access to the Sentinel workspace, wherein they have some overlapping data that they need access to. And Sentinel monitoring team is not shown in this image. But if you want to put it here, you can put it somewhere here and put a arrow here pointing towards Sentinel workspace. So that's the design for this is the simplest design when you have single Azure AD tenant. In this design, they're also not showing AWS part. So you can put AWS part anywhere. that they also have a data connector for AWS, which is ingesting all the data into operational workspace, because they want to monitor AWS, but they want to monitor the AWS CloudTrail event data. And if there is any overlapping data, then you will consider it here, wherein the operations team will have table level RBAC. So this is the design. So this was the simple one. Any question on this?
Is this table level RBAC kind of read-only access?
RBAC is RBAC. I'm saying in RBAC, you can decide read-only or administrative both.
So I just want to
But in this
understand this term table level.
Table level, so basically what happens here, let me take you to the, give me a moment. So this is my log analytics workspace, which is connected to Sentinel, let's say. These are my tables. These are my tables. You can see these are the tables in which data is kept. Now let's say there's a table on which this is the table, Azure activity. Now on this table, operations teams need access, and my security team also need access. Now what will be the level of access for the security team? Admin. And what will be the level of access for the operations team? Read only. And you can also see this information here in the logs. You can see tables, design category. These are the tables. So you can put it resource type, category type, or solution. So put it like category. So these are the tables. So here I will define the RBAC. So definitely my operations team would not need administrative access on any table which is overlapping. So if there is a table which is related to infrastructure monitoring, wherein I'm only getting infrastructure CPU and memory utilization data, infrastructure monitoring data, then that data will actually flow into. So when you create data collection rules, I'm saying you will go to that specific workspace and you will create the data collection rules. This is log analytics workspace. So you will go to Azure Monitor basically, and you will create data collection rules. When you create data collection rules, if you remember, so for example, I'll go to Azure Monitor here. So, okay, data collection rule. So let's say I'm creating the ingestion. This is the pre-configuration. When I'm creating the ingestion, what I do? Let's say this is my infra monitoring. Infra monitoring data, which is CPU and memory utilization, infrastructure specific monitoring data. So I'll select my resource group. Let's say this one. And here I will select all definitely because I want infrastructure data for all my servers. Then I'll go to resources here. I'll select my resources. Let's say I've selected this VM and these VMs. Now for these VMs, I want to collect the infrastructure related data, the monitoring data, infrastructure monitoring data. So what I will select performance counters. I can select more performance counters, whatever I want to select, and I'll go to destination. Now in the destination here, what I'm going to put here, the workspace that I will put here, when I select the destination, the workspace that I will put here will be the workspace that is primarily meant for monitoring team, because this is infrastructure related data. Now, when I select the security related data, which is at data sources, and let's say I want to collect event logs. Now this event logs. So this is security related data. For this data, when I select the workspace, I select the Sentinel workspace. Okay. Now in the Sentinel workspace, security related data will go. And in the operational workspace, infrastructure monitoring data will go. operations team will have complete access on the operational data, but they also need access on the security data. For example, a VM was restarted. Now operations team is investigating it. It's not a security incident. When the VM gets restarted, it is not a security incident. It got restarted because of high CPU utilization. Some process caused CPU, some process user 32 process caused VM reboot. Now monitoring team, infrastructure monitoring team is investigating it. They will need access to the event logs, because in the event logs, they will be able to see, they will go to the system event logs, and in the system event log, they will get the visibility that which user restarted the VM. Okay, so they need event logs. Similarly, they also need Azure activity logs, because in the Azure activity logs, they will see the activity of the Azure portal, which is the user who started the VM. Maybe the VM was restarted inside the OS, event log will tell. If the VM was restarted from the portal, then the Azure activity log will tell. So my operations team need access to both security events as well as Azure activity events. Now, how will I grant access to them? I cannot grant them access to my Sentinel Workspace because it will contain more than the required access. So what I will do, I know that my security events and my Azure activity logs are getting ingested into the tables. So I will identify that specific table and grant table level access to my operations team. When I say operations team, to the security group of the operations team, which contains all the operation team members. That's what I will do. Or if I have bifurcation operations team like L1 operations, L2 operations, L3 operations, then I will need to discuss it with the operation team leader, operation team manager, that who or which level needs access to the overlapping logs. Am I making sense? So this is more of a process related decision that you need to take.
Thank you.
Did this answer your question?
Yes, sir.
Okay, great. Okay, so this session is very important, very critical for people who want to, who aspire to get into consulting, get into architecture, get into the engineering side of the world. Okay, so this was my second design. Now, similarly, you have another sample. So there are 3 samples here in this, in this documentation, which is more than sufficient to understand the architecture design best practices or architecture design considerations. My third sample is multiple tenants and regions and centralized security. So multiple tenants, multiple regions, which means my company has offices across the globe. And we have done multiple acquisitions in the past. So multiple tenants. We in fact have AWS and GCP also. And we have on-premises log sources also. But my team is centralized. The condition is, take Microsoft example. Microsoft MSIT. So Microsoft has a campus in Hyderabad, which is their second largest campus after Redmond, Washington campus. And in that campus, there are 3 buildings in Hyderabad. Building number 1, which is for Microsoft IDC, Microsoft India Development Center. Building number 2, Microsoft IT, MSIT. Building number 3, Microsoft Global Delivery, MSG. Building number 2 has centralized IT. There are some infrastructures of Microsoft and some services of Microsoft which are only managed, monitored, and maintained in this building number 2 across the globe. So there is no second team in the world anywhere which takes care of that specific service. It is only done from building number 2 from Hyderabad. If that building number 2 experiences an outage, if something goes wrong, that service will not be monitored. That service will not be managed. That is known as centralized security. Now, that is not security. Microsoft security team is decentralized. Microsoft has 3,000 plus security professionals posted across the globe in various countries and geographies, taking care of Microsoft infrastructure and Microsoft services security. So that MSIT team in building number 2 is the IT security, is the IT infrastructure monitoring team responsible for certain applications. So consider the same scenario here, wherein you have a centralized security team that sits in one geography, and that team is responsible for management, maintenance of security operations across the globe in all the offices and for all the data sources. So that is my third scenario, which is a bit complicated, and that is why they call it AdventureWorks, because this is an adventure that you will go on now. So AdventureWorks is a multinational company with headquarters in Tokyo, and now their headquarters is in Tokyo, Japan, and they have 10 different sub entities based in different countries, regions around the world. So there are 10 different entities which are across the world, and they are Microsoft 365 E5 customer. E5 is the highest license, which includes Azure AD Premium P2 capability also, and they already have workloads in Azure. Now tenancy, they have 3 different tenants, one for each continent, where they have sub entities. So they have 3 tenants: Asia, Europe, and Africa. So 1 tenant for Asia. Now inside Asia, they may have entities in 2 countries. So inside Asia, you have Japan, and let's say you have India also. Inside Europe, they have 1 tenant, and inside Africa, they have another tenant. The different sub entities, countries, regions have their identities in the tenant of the continent they belong to. For example, Japanese users are in Asia tenant, German users are in Europe tenant, and Egyptian users are in Africa tenant. So Asia, Europe, and Africa. Okay. Now their compliance requirements. Definitely wherever Europe comes, understand that you need a separate workspace. So Europe is always out from the discussion. It needs everything separate. So AdventureWorks currently uses 3 Azure regions, which resides in the sub entities, which is Asia, Europe, and Africa, and they doesn't have strict compliance requirements. This is incorrect. If it is Europe, they have to have. So we'll consider GDPR here, and we will assume that they need a separate workspace in Europe for sure. AdventureWorks resource type and collection requirements. So the resource type and collection requirements are this. I'm saying it is common for all they all need Azure AD sign-in and audit logs. They all need M365 logs. If Defender is enabled, they need logs from there. Azure activity is common. MS Defender for cloud is common. PaaS resources, and we have Azure storage, and they need logs from Azure, which is security and events logs from Azure VM. They need CF logs from on-premises and network devices also. Now, Azure VMs are scattered across the 3 continents, but bandwidth costs aren't a concern. So why they are giving you this clue? Because they might want you to consider having the same tenant. They're giving you 2 clues here. Bandwidth costs are not a concern, and second, they don't have strict compliance requirements, which means I can have 1 workspace in their head office, which is in Japan. Yeah, headquarter in Japan, Tokyo. So I can have 1 workspace in Japan region, and in that workspace, I can ingest data from everywhere. This is what they are saying. Okay, next, but don't forget they have 3 tenants. All right, then comes access requirements. So since they have a centralized SOC team, so they have a centralized SOC team that oversees security operations for all different sub entities. AdventureWorks also has 3 independent SOC teams, 1 for each continent. Now they have a centralized SOC team and independent SOC team also for each continent. Each continent SOC team should be able, and this is what expected, because you have Europe in picture. It cannot happen that I sit in India and I manage Europe customers. No, this is not allowed. GDPR doesn't even allow this. So in fact, SAP has a separate HR module. I'm saying people who are sitting in India, if DXC has an office in Europe, and if you are using centralized SAP HR module, the HR in India will not have access to the data of employees who are in Europe. No access. That module will be inaccessible to people in India. It will only be accessible to people in Europe. And if it happens, then it's a violation of GDPR. As long as it does not come to light, you are good. The moment it comes to light, you will be in trouble. So, and this happened with one of my customers when I was deploying the Sentinel. While discussing with the client, I came across this, that they have a centralized HR module in which, as they were using SAP HR module, and I asked the same question. So I said, does your HR have access to an employee in Europe? And the person said, yes, my HR has all the access. I said, wow. So you're sitting on a volcano. It may burst at any time. Anyways, so I informed them that what is not right, and they fixed it there. Okay. So then they had this anomaly because they recently started operations in Europe. So they were really not aware. They were aware of the GDPR, but they never hired a consultant because it was too expensive to actually help them with setting up the environment as per GDPR compliance. They thought that we are just beginning in that geography. We are very small there. We don't receive so much of revenue from that geography. So it doesn't make sense to invest into security and call for an external GDPR consultant. Okay, so let's see so they should be able to access only the data generated within that region. So here you see the answer. So it says that they have 3 independent SOC teams, 1 for each continent, and each continent SOC team should be able to access only the data generated within its region. This is where they come into the compliance. That the SOC team sitting in US should not be, sorry, SOC team sitting in Africa should not be able to see the data of Europe or Japan without seeing data from other continents. For example, the Asia SOC team is only able to see the data from Azure resources deployed in Asia, Azure AD sign-in logs from Asia tenant, and Defender for endpoint logs from its Asia tenant. Each continent SOC team needs to have access to full Microsoft Sentinel portal experience, and AdventureWorks operations team run independently has its own workspace with Microsoft Sentinel. So there they also have an operations team. They have their own workspaces with Microsoft they have their own workspaces without Microsoft Sentinel. Now the solution. So my solution is simple.
I think you're on mute.
Okay. I don't know how come it went on mute. Okay. So I was here. So done with this. Now we are looking at the design that what solution they will use. So my solution is that they will. Okay. So now the solution is that they will use since there are 3 continents and they need to have separate teams which should only be able to see that data. So they will definitely be using 3 separate Sentinel workspaces, 1 for each continent and 1 for each tenant also, because they have tenant also. And then they have 3 Azure AD tenants needs to collect data, tenant level data. So which means they will have at least Microsoft Sentinel workspace, 1 for each tenant. Now there is no need to split charges, which means that if in Japan there are multiple locations where their VMs are, they can have all the VMs log ingested into one workspace, which they have created in one of the Japan region. So which means one workspace in each tenant, which takes care of the geography also. So since Adventure Workspace has its own workspace, data considered will be collected by SOC team. Bandwidth costs are the major concern. Adventure doesn't need to segregate data by ownership, so each content SOC team needs to access only the data that is relevant to that content. However, each content SOC team, continent SOC team also needs to access to full Microsoft Sentinel portal. Adventure Works doesn't need to control data access by table. They don't need to control access by table. The resulting Microsoft Sentinel Workspace design for Adventure Works is illustrated in the following example. You can see the design. So here they are using cross workspace management. Okay. Now you can see they have a tenant in Asia, a tenant in Africa, tenant in Europe. Now this cross workspace management doesn't mean there is one workspace. No, it basically means that there are multiple workspaces. So, but all of those workspaces are ingesting logs into the same Sentinel. Or all of those workspaces are integrated to the same Sentinel instance. And the question is, where is that instance? Can somebody tell me where will be my Sentinel instance? Where will be my Sentinel instance? In which tenant? In which region? In which subscription? We have Europe, Africa, and Asia, 3 continents where this company has businesses. So where will be my Sentinel instance? In which continent, which region, which subscription? Use your brain, guys. I've been talking about it since the morning. I've been focusing on security and regulatory requirements in all the design considerations. Where will be my Sentinel instance?
I believe there will be two, one for Europe and for Asia and Africa, it will be in US.
No, it will be one because it's a centralized workspace management. See here, my Sentinel instance will be in Europe, which means all my workspaces will be integrated in Europe. So in Europe, I'm saying the tenant, inside the tenant, there will be a subscription in Europe in which I will be integrating it. So it will be in Europe actually.
Right.
So the central SOC here means, it doesn't mean that you have one workspace. It means that you have multiple workspaces, but they all are connected to the same Sentinel service. And that Sentinel service happens to be part of a subscription which is configured in Europe. Make sense? When you redeemed your Azure sponsorship pass, did you not provide a location? You provided a location. So your location is India, and my friends in Australia, their location, their subscription is registered in Australia. So in the same manner, the subscription that is registered in Europe or the tenant of Europe will have Microsoft Sentinel instance. And to that instance, all the workspaces will be attached. And why? Because they have a central SOC. That is why it is happening. If it would not have been central SOC, if it would have been the solution 1 or 2, the sample 1 or 2, then you can see here there's a separate team. But since here it's a centralized SOC, that is why it says cross workspace management. So all the workspace are ingesting I'm saying all the workspace, they are connected to the same Sentinel instance, but the Sentinel instance happens to be in a subscription or in a tenant that is registered in Europe. That's the catch here. That's what you need to understand. And then you can see that you have, and it clearly says here, see, Asia workspace, Africa workspace, Europe workspace, and all of them are being managed in this central SOC. And this central SOC Sentinel is Europe. Now it should be written here somewhere. The suggested solution includes a separate Microsoft Sentinel workspace for each Azure AD tenant. So you can see that for each tenant, there's a Sentinel, there is a separate workspace. Each workspace collects data related to its tenant for all data sources. Now this workspace is collecting data for all its data sources. Same is the case with Africa and Asia. Then each continent SOC team has access only to the workspace of its own tenant. Now SOC team will have only access to this workspace, ensuring that only logs generated within the tenant boundary are accessible to the SOC team. The central SOC team can still operate from a separate Azure AD tenant using Azure Lighthouse. Now this is where Lighthouse comes into the picture. This is for central SOC team. So consider central SOC team as DXC, who is managing 3 different customers. So these are 3 different customers. Customer name is Asia, Africa, and Europe, and this is DXC. Now, with the use of Lighthouse, DXC is able to manage 3 different customers. And those customers have their own internal teams as well, which have access to their data only. It is the perfect use case for DXC or for your operations requirement. So for you, this central SOC is DXC, which has access to all the data, but the individual operations team belonging to the customer have access to their operations related data only. That's the perfect scenario. So they are using Lighthouse to access each of the different Microsoft Sentinel environment. If there is no other tenant, the central SOC team can still use Azure Lighthouse to access the remote workspaces. So if there is no other tenant, then they can use remote workspace also. Now the central SOC team can also create another workspace if it needs to store artifacts that remain hidden from the continent SOC team, or if it wants to ingest other data that isn't relevant to the continent SOC team. So the central SOC team, if it needs some separate data, if it needs to hide something from the individual continent teams, they can create a separate workspace. They can ingest data into that workspace and manage that workspace using the Lighthouse service also. This is the solution. So in this solution, you only see the centralized management part, but this solution, when you double click on this solution will also reflect this image and this image also. Let me know if you have any questions. So I will show you Lighthouse demo. Definitely, you will not be able to do it on your in your lab environment. You will need multiple tenants. So I will put together a demo probably over the weekend in my account, because I've got I'm saying I will need to have 2-3 tenants. So I will do that over the weekend and show you the capabilities of Lighthouse also, that how you can use Lighthouse as an MSSP to manage multiple tenants, multiple workspaces belonging to different customers, and how you can uh, request, or how you can get appropriate RBAC for each tenant, for each workspace, so you can deliver relevant roles. For example, for one customer, you're only acting as L1. So your job is to only read the logs and forward it to the concerned team. For the other customer, you are also acting at L2, wherein you are also an incident responder. So you will need some level of access to their environment. For the third customer, you are acting as L3, which means you have both L1, L2, and L3 working for the customer. So you need more access. And there is a fourth customer for which you are only acting as consultant. So you will only need read-only access to their tenant, to their workspace, so that you can analyze the design. You can analyze the various aspects with respect to log ingestion, tables, the processes that they follow, analytics rule, and use cases that they have created. And you can suggest, you can recommend them some optimization, some improvements, some additional use cases and whatnot. Now, all of that is possible through Lighthouse. And don't consider that Lighthouse is only applicable in this scenario. Lighthouse is a multi-tenant management service. So in any scenario, Lighthouse can fit. You can use Lighthouse for infrastructure monitoring as well. When you are monitoring the infrastructure for multiple customers, you can use Lighthouse for multi-tenant management. So any use case, so which basically means that if you need access to multiple customers' environment, and instead of asking them to create an account for yourself, you can use Lighthouse, through which you can get authorization to their environment, and you can have access to their environment. That's what Lighthouse is all about. So that is about those 3 use cases, which summarizes all the considerations, which are single tenant architecture, multiple tenant architecture, single tenant with single subscription, multi-tenant with multi-subscription, or multi-tenant with single geography, multi-tenant with multiple geographies, centralized team, decentralized team. All the use cases that you can think of are, are, is part of these 3 sample architectures, which means tomorrow, if you get into a discussion with a new potential customer, and if you come across similar use case, or when you get into the discussion, keep these scenarios in mind and ask the relevant questions to the customer, so that you will be able to gather the requirements the way they have gathered the requirements here: type and collection requirements, regional requirements, tenancy requirements. So you will be able to gather the relevant requirements, and you will be able to put together the solution. And the solution will be based on the decision tree that I have showed you. Okay. So this is about architecture and design considerations, best practices. You can also see best practices here. You already have know those best practices. For example, tenancy considerations. So Microsoft says that try and have a single tenant architecture as much as possible. But if you don't have that single tenant architecture in scope, or if customer does not have time and energy to consolidate, then go with the second and third use case, wherein there are multiple tenants and multiple, uh, multiple subscriptions. Working with multiple tenants, it shows you that you can use, when you are using multiple tenants, it says that you can use Azure Lighthouse to help manage multiple Sentinel instances in different tenants. Compliance considerations, always take into consideration. This is one of the best practice. Always ask the right questions to your customer, that who you are, what business you are into, what is your legal and compliance requirements. If they don't themselves know, then help them to understand it first, because you are deploying a security solution. Regional considerations. So regional considerations, you need to take into cost the egress cost. It should not happen that you create a workspace in central India, or let's say it should not happen that you create a workspace in East US, which is New York, where you have 5 VMs and you have 500 VMs in West US, and you are ingesting data of those 500 VMs from West US to East US. It's a destructive design, because imagine the egress cost that you will have. You should rather create your workspace in West US and ingest the logs of these 5 VMs into West US from East US. So take into consideration the regional also. So those 7 steps in the decision matrix contains all of this. Okay. Then access consideration, which is very important. As I said, use least restrictive access, policy, and wherever there is an overlapping information that multiple people need access to, try and grant table level RBAC. So this is where it shows the access, that this is your security team, this is other team, and this is where your Azure resources are. So your security team comprises of security monitoring team, SOC analyst, and SOC engineers. Now your environment comprises of security monitoring. This is the RBAC. So you have security monitoring reader role, which you have allocated to the resource group, which is containing the Sentinel Workspace. So security monitoring reader role, there is one role. Then you have security monitoring security reader role, now which is divided into 2. Here you can see you have application group 2. One is contributor. Here you have some services. So what this table is trying to say, that you should make use of RBAC, resource level RBAC. Instead of granting RBAC at subscription level, use resource base. So that's what it says. Give me a moment. All right, is my screen visible to everyone? Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm sharing this best practices for Microsoft Sentinel. Now, this is a great piece of document, and it will take a couple of hours to actually go through this document. And that is why I want you to go through this document in your spare time and come back with any questions that you may have. Some of them will be answered in the subsequent sessions all by itself, but you can still make a note of those questions and share it with me. So it shows best practices for Sentinel. Now it includes best practices for both engineering and operation functions. Now the one that says admin user is the engineering. I'm just trying to kind of relate it to what you do in DXC. So you have engineering team and you have operations team. So the one that says admin users is the engineering, and the one that says analyst is the operational. These are the best practices. Now, these best practices, we have covered some of them already. For example, pre-deployment activities, prerequisites of deployment Microsoft Sentinel. We have already covered that we need a subscription, we need a tenant, we need log sources, we need a log analytics workspace in the data, and we ingest the data into the log analytics workspace. Then we connect log analytics workspace to Sentinel, and that's how Sentinel gets built. So prerequisites, we know workspace architecture best practices we have just covered. I'm saying we spent the entire session today, 4 hours of session in the architecture design and best practices, because that is very important for somebody who is part of deployment, who is an architect, who is a consultant, who is part of the engineering and admin. Design your Microsoft Sentinel Workspace architecture. We have covered all the three. So we have covered all the three in this session today. Then comes data collection best practices. Now, I already talked about those best practices. The only best practice to data collection is that identify what you need to connect. First, you would have 100 things in your mind, but keep in mind one thing, that it has a cost to everything that you collect. So identify your mission critical workloads and applications and data sources for which you need to collect the logs. That's the first thing that you need to identify. Second, you will need to identify that what you want to connect. So the first decision is to identify so when it comes to collection, best practices data collection, first you need to identify what all data sources are important from security monitoring perspective. That's the first thing. Second, out of those identified data sources, what specific data need to be ingested into Sentinel, ingested or collected into Sentinel. That's what you need to identify. These are the two best practices, and the rest of the best practices will revolve around these two best practices only. Because when you identify what all data sources are important, this is first thing. So for example, you identify the way we have identified in the examples that Azure AD sign in and audit logs are important. M365 logs are important. VM logs are important. Networking security devices logs are important for you. So this is how you've identified the data sources. Whatever, any third-party data source that you have in mind, third-party source. Then comes the second question, which is out of these identified data sources. Now, when it comes to Azure AD sign-in and audit logs, you must have seen in the collector, there are multiple parameters. There are more than 12 parameters. What exactly you want to collect? So similarly, from Office M365 logs, you could have thousands of logs getting ingested. But what is your important log? Maybe I'm more focused on failure logs. When somebody is trying to sign into a mailbox and not able to do it. When somebody is trying to sign into a mailbox from an unusual location, unusual IP address, blacklisted IP address. That's what I want to ingest. That's what I want to collect from security perspective. VM logs. I don't want to collect CPU and memory utilization, disk utilization. I am more interested into collecting security events, networking and security device logs. I don't want to unnecessarily collect all the filtered traffic which is allowed. What will I do with that? I am more interested into collecting the traffic which is denied. Or I am more interested to collect the similar information from other devices. So you will need to identify that what specific data I need to collect from the identified data sources. That's the another best practice. And then the best practice will revolve around networking and security also, access management also, that who will need access. So it says that first prioritize your data connectors, that what you need to connect. And then second, filter your logs before ingestion. You will need to filter the logs also. I don't want to collect everything. I want to collect specific. So I want to collect performance logs. I want to collect security and event logs from my virtual machines. So when I create the data collection rule, I will only select the event logs and security logs. So filter your logs using one of the methods. I mean, say Azure Monitor Agent, Logstash, which is a third-party service, leave it. Alternate data ingestion requirements. Then you want to ingest data from various services also. So the crux of this documentation, because this best practices documentation, you will take a couple of hours to go through it. But the crux here is that there are some common best practices that will always remain there. So there are some common security best practices which will remain common respective of the service. So those best practices are around IAM, they are around compute, they are around data repositories, or you can say storage service, they are around networking. They are some common security best practices which will be around these areas. And the last but not the least is governance. So there are some common security best practices. For example, in IAM, whether it's Sentinel, whether it's any service in Azure, follow the principle of least privilege. Follow RBAC, resource-specific RBAC instead of subscription-specific RBAC. Follow just-in-time access, privileged identity management, privileged access management, access package creation, certification, identity lifecycle management. Follow all of these, configure Azure AD identity protection, configure user and entity behavior analytics, UEBA. These are the security best practices around IAM. Similarly, compute security best practices, identify what you need to collect, and what specific data you need to collect. Storage account, configure diagnostics, send it to storage logs. Networking security best practices, that you should use network security group, follow the principle of segmentation, collocate resources of similar nature into a specific segment. You make use of Azure firewall, follow the principle of defense in depth, follow the principle of zero trust network approach, and then from the governance, have standards in place, identify the policies and standards that you need to enforce, write them down, and then identify the implementation steps. Implement them using Azure Blueprint, Azure Purview, Azure Microsoft Entra, which is now the new name for Azure Active Directory, or Azure Policy, or Azure Management Group. You have a couple of services to manage the governance aspect of it. So there are some common best practices, and then there are service specific security best practices. Now, when it comes to service specific security best practices, you're focused on Microsoft Sentinel. And for Microsoft Sentinel service specific security best practices, here's the reference document, which I pasted into the chat window that you can reference. It has all the best practices. Some of them we will definitely cover in this training. Some we will not, because we may not have available time with us. We may not have that level of lab information available with us. So we will at least cover them theoretically if we cannot do hands-on lab around it. Or if I may have access, I can show you from one of my customers' environment that how this is done. Or I can show you, if not the actual live portal, I will show you some screenshots by removing the, removing the references to the customers. So that's what you need to do. So that is about the best practices of Sentinel. This was all that we wanted to cover from the Microsoft Sentinel getting started, from the architecture or prerequisites perspective, design architecture, best practices. Tomorrow, we will get back to Microsoft Sentinel, and we will start with the next step. Now that we have logs ingested into our log analytics workspace, which is connected to Sentinel, and we have started getting all the logs into the Sentinel also. We may have a couple of events already created by Sentinel. We will need to move further. That what is my next step after configuration of logs? After I'm done with, after I'm done with the workspace architecture and best practices, after I'm done designing the Sentinel workspace architecture, which in my case is single workspace architecture. After I'm done with configuring all the data collection, which is my connectors and individual collection that I'm doing through Azure Monitor Agent, like diagnostic logs and data connectors. I'm also well aware of the cost and billing now because I've shown you how Sentinel is built. Now comes permissions. I've also shown you the Sentinel RBAC, that what Sentinel RBAC is there. Now comes the actual this part, that from this moment onwards, I will need to understand the operational aspects of Sentinel, that how what these options are that I see in the console, and how I can work with these options, which is more of an operational aspect. But you will need to look from admin eyes, because you are going to configure these solutions one after another.